My son's lavish Christmas Eve dinner started out looking warm and picture perfect, right up until my phone screen lit up with an unknown number. When I answered, a panicked, breathless voice whispered on the other end, "Go back to your house right now. Don't tell a soul." I listened to that voice, and when I rushed back to my old home, what I saw completely broke my heart. But it also sparked a war that I was more than ready to finish. Before I go any further, if you've ever had to stand your ground and protect yourself against the very people who were supposed to love you most, take a second to give yourself some credit. My name is Arthur Vance, and I'm 71 years old. Up until that snowy Thursday evening in Boston, I truly believed I had done everything a father could possibly do for his son. Inside my son Lucas's modern glass-walled mansion in the wealthy suburb of Weston, the air was thick with the scent of truffle-roasted beef, expensive red wine, and suffocating hypocrisy. I sat at the far end of the long dining table, watching the people I called family put on a theatrical performance of gratitude and happiness. My 37-year-old daughter-in-law, Valerie, filled my crystal glass with heavy bourbon yet again. That was already her fourth attempt to keep me glued to that velvet dining chair with alcohol. She smiled, but her eyes were ice cold, watching me the way a vulture eyes a wounded rabbit. "Arthur, you absolutely have to stay for the Christmas pudding," Valerie insisted, her voice dripping with that sickeningly sweet, fake tone she always used whenever she wanted something from someone. "Besides, it's just not safe for you to drive all the way back to that big, empty house of yours in Boston's Back Bay by yourself. Have another drink. Just relax. We're just really worried about your mental state, Arthur. You've seemed so forgetful and frail lately." I hadn't forgotten a single thing in my entire life, and I definitely didn't miss the blatant condescension in her voice. I looked over at my son. Lucas was 39, the CEO of a logistics tech startup, managing dozens of employees. Yet, in his own dining room, the moment his old money, high society wife, a senior wealth manager at a top investment bank, opened her mouth, he shrank into a silent, spineless shadow. He kept his head down, focusing entirely on cutting the beef on his plate, deliberately avoiding my eyes. He knew exactly what Valerie was doing. He knew she was insulting me, building a false narrative right to my face that I was losing my mind. But he didn't have the guts to stand up for the father who had sacrificed everything to put him through the Ivy League. The air in that room felt heavy enough to choke on. Every single comment out of Valerie's mouth was a vicious curse, wrapped up in fake concern. To her, the entire world was made of numbers, assets, and leverage. I wasn't her father-in-law. I was just a ticking clock tied to a prime piece of Boston real estate. I took a slow sip of my ice water, leaving the bourbon completely untouched. Just as I was about to politely excuse myself and leave, the phone in my coat pocket vibrated violently. It was an unknown number. I stood up, forcing a controlled smile. "Excuse me for a moment," I said, walking toward the foyer, while completely ignoring Valerie's impatient sigh at being interrupted. I picked up, expecting a holiday telemarketer. Instead, the terrified voice of a young man came through the receiver, his breath rapid with pure anxiety. "Mr. Vance, you don't know me. My name is David. I work with Valerie in compliance at the investment bank. You need to go back to your house right now. This second. Don't tell them you're leaving. Don't ask questions. Just get in your car and drive." Before I could say a single word, the line went dead. The silence ringing in my ear was deafening. A cold wave of dread washed over me, settling deep in my chest. But I didn't panic. When you've lived as long as I have, you learn how to spot danger the exact second the ground begins to crack beneath your feet. I slid my phone back into my pocket, my mind racing. I walked back into the dining room, grabbed my heavy wool coat off the back of the chair, and looked straight at Lucas. "I'm leaving," I said flatly, my voice carrying a quiet, absolute authority that left no room for argument. Valerie snapped upright, her chair screeching loudly against the expensive hardwood floor. "Arthur, stop this," she barked, completely dropping her sweet act. "You can't drive. You've had way too much to drink. It's not safe." She moved quickly, blocking my path, a flash of frantic desperation in her blue eyes that only confirmed David's warning. I hadn't touched a drop of that liquor, and she knew it better than anyone. "Get out of my way, Valerie," I said calmly, looking right through her. Lucas finally found his voice, stammering nervously as he wiped his hands with his napkin. "Dad, if Mom were alive, she'd want us to be together tonight. Please, just sit back down." Bringing up my late wife, Eleanor, was a massive mistake. If your mother were alive, she would be completely disgusted by this hollow dinner and this fake conversation, I shot back coldly. I walked right past Valerie, stepped out at the front door, and got into my car without looking back. The drive back into downtown Boston usually took about 40 minutes. The November wind slapped against my windshield like a knife, but it couldn't cool down the anger boiling in my veins. My mind replayed every single suspicious moment from the past few months. Valerie constantly asking about the deed to my townhouse. Lucas subtly dropping hints that I should look into high-end assisted living because the stairs in my house were too dangerous. A son who couldn't remember my birthday for 3 years in a row was suddenly deeply, intensely interested in the health of my financial portfolio. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. David's terrified voice kept echoing in my ears. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, forming an incredibly twisted, sickening picture. But as I rounded the final corner onto my street, my heart stopped cold. A massive, unmarked white commercial van was parked right in front of my house. Its mud-caked, heavy-duty tires were ruthlessly crushing the rose bushes Eleanor had planted with her own hands 15 years ago. My solid wood front door, the one I had spent an entire weekend installing myself to keep my family safe, had its lock completely drilled out. The door was wide open, hanging off broken hinges. The inside of the house was brightly lit, casting frantic, moving shadows onto the snow outside. Strangers, at least half a dozen men in dark jumpsuits, were swarming my private property like locusts, clearing out my entire life's work. I watched in absolute horror as 2 men dragged my antique mahogany desk down the front steps, the wood scraping harshly against the brick. Another man was carrying heavy cardboard boxes filled with my most personal belongings, including Eleanor's carefully collected, out-of-print books and 40 years of our family photo albums. They were tossing them brutally into the deep, dark back of the van like they were throwing away garbage. I shut off the engine and stepped out of the car, feeling a deep, primal rage that momentarily took my breath away. To me, this wasn't just a building. More than 30 years ago, when Eleanor and I first bought this place, we endured all kinds of quiet rejection and hostile stares from the neighborhood. We worked ourselves to the bone. I poured concrete on high-rise construction sites between Chicago and Boston until my hands bled, and Eleanor taught in public schools until her voice went hoarse, just to prove we belonged here. Every brick, every floorboard in that house was bought with our sweat, tears, and undeniable dignity. It was our fortress. And now my own flesh and blood, the son I gave everything to raise, had sent strangers to ransack it like common thieves on Christmas Eve. I didn't yell. I didn't call the police. I walked slowly up the driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. My hands were balled into tight fists inside my coat pockets, my brain already calculating every single step of the war I was about to unleash. A burly foreman with a thick beard and a heavy clipboard stepped out of my foyer, shouting at the movers to hurry up. He stopped when he saw me approaching, casually wiping the sweat from his forehead. He didn't look guilty at all. He didn't look like a criminal caught red-handed breaking and entering. He just looked incredibly annoyed by my presence. He walked down the steps, stepping right over the splintered wood of my doorframe, and walked up to me with total confidence. "You must be Arthur," he said, his tone flat and completely dismissive. There was no apology. Instead, he pulled a folded, officially stamped legal document from his heavy jacket and shoved it right against my chest. I took the thick parchment from his rough hand and held it up under the harsh, yellow headlights of the van. The bold black letters at the top of the page seemed to vibrate in the freezing wind. Emergency Medical and Financial Conservatorship Order. I scanned through the dense legal jargon, my eyes darting across the clauses that granted absolute control over my property, my medical decisions, and all of my financial assets to Lucas and Valerie. But what made my blood run completely cold was at the bottom of the second page. There in black and white was the undeniable signature of an attending physician, right next to an expedited court stamp. My mind raced backward like a rewinded tape, trying to figure out how this trap had been set. Then the memory hit me like a physical punch to the gut. 2 months ago, I'd spent a few days at a private recovery clinic for a severe cold and a minor bout of pneumonia. Valerie had gone out of her way to arrange that specific clinic and a private doctor named Thorne, claiming it was a company perk. While I was there, she handed me a thick stack of paperwork, telling me they were just standard insurance release forms. I had a fever, my head was cloudy, and I trusted my son's wife. I signed them without even putting on my reading glasses. She had used my weakness while I was sick. She combined it with a falsified medical evaluation from a bought-off doctor, claiming I had severe cognitive decline and prescription drug abuse. Then, using the legal loopholes she knew inside and out, she went straight to a judge for an emergency conservatorship, completely stripping away my rights as an independent adult. The foreman crossed his arms over his chest, his breath turning to thick white fog in the freezing night air. "Look, man," he said, his voice completely stripped of sympathy. "I don't care about your family drama. Your son and his wife hired our company this morning. They showed us court-certified paperwork. They told us you have severe Alzheimer's with a history of violent outbursts, that you're being put into a forced care facility tonight, and they need this house emptied immediately for an emergency sale. If you've got an issue with that, take it up with them. We're just the muscle." He turned his back on me, barking an order at 2 men hauling my leather armchair out the door. I looked down at the document again. It was legally binding. Valerie worked for a top wealth management firm. She knew exactly how the system worked, and she knew how to fast-track a court stamp so it would slide through the system without raising a single red flag. The trap was absolutely flawless. If I called the police right now, they would show up, look at a legally binding conservatorship order, and then look at an angry, unhinged 71-year-old man hurling wild accusations at his highly successful son and daughter-in-law. Valerie would immediately play the victim. She would show the officers the paperwork, claim I was having a severe psychotic break, and instead of helping me, the police would be legally required to haul me away to a psychiatric ward. That was exactly what she wanted. I was never going to give her that satisfaction. I didn't scream. I didn't curse. I carefully folded the document, slid it into my coat pocket, and walked backward out of my own front yard. Every step felt like retreating from a battlefield, where I had been ambushed completely unarmed. I got back into my car and locked the doors, cutting myself off from the biting wind and the horrific sight of my entire life being dismantled piece by piece. Sitting there in the driver's seat, my brain rapidly shifted from the shock of betrayal to cold, hard survival logic. If Valerie had the legal authority to clean out my house, she had the legal authority to drain my bank accounts. She was a senior wealth manager. She understood leverage, and she knew that cutting off my cash flow was the fastest way to force me into total submission. I pulled out my phone and quickly dialed the 24-hour hotline for the brokerage firm, holding my retirement funds and everyday checking account. The operator's voice was polite and professional. "Mr. Vance, how can I help you tonight?" "I need to put an immediate freeze on all accounts under my name," I said, keeping my voice incredibly steady, refusing to let the panic consuming me slip through. "I believe my financial information has been compromised." "Please hold for just a moment while I pull up your file," she replied. The grueling hold music played for 30 seconds. When she finally clicked back onto the line, her tone had completely shifted. It was no longer helpful. It was guarded. "I'm sorry, Mr. Vance, but looking at your file here, I see a full asset freeze and transfer was already initiated this afternoon." "Initiated by whom?" I demanded, my fingers gripping the phone so hard the plastic casing creaked. By your legal conservator, the operator said firmly. A Ms. Valerie Vance submitted a court-certified conservatorship order to our compliance director at 3 o'clock today. According to the notes on your file, your access has been revoked due to medical incapacity, and all liquid funds, roughly $150,000, have been moved to a secure trust account under her direct management. Because she is a certified senior financial professional, the transfer was expedited. I cannot authorize any transactions or restore your access without her explicit written consent. She had used her corporate credentials and that stolen medical evaluation to completely cut off my lifeline. The retirement fund I had bled for during 40 years on construction sites, the savings I used to buy groceries and pay the electric bill, were gone. While she was smiling at me over roasted beef, she was executing a flawless financial execution. I thanked the operator and hung up. The silence inside the car was heavy and absolute. I had officially become a ghost in my own life. I looked through the windshield, watching the movers carry out Eleanor's antique hutch. Watching this violation play out brought back a bitter memory of Lucas. Even as a little boy, Lucas had an insatiable, bottomless greed. Eleanor used to say he had a hole in his soul that no amount of allowance or new toys could ever fill. When we bought him things, he was never grateful. He would just stare at what the neighbor kids had and complain that we hadn't given him enough. I spent a lifetime trying to teach him the value of hard work, trying to show him that respect is earned, not demanded. But he always chose the easiest shortcut. He wanted the corner office without putting in the hours, and he wanted the luxury lifestyle without breaking a sweat. And when he married Valerie, a woman whose entire existence was defined by price tags and profit margins, that childhood greed mutated into a real monster. Together they had decided that my life was worth more to them liquidated. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my wallet. Under the dim overhead light of the car, I opened it. I had exactly $42 in cash. My credit cards were now just useless pieces of plastic. My property in the heart of Boston was being stripped to the bones by strangers. I couldn't touch my retirement. Outside, the temperature was dropping fast below freezing, and the bitter wind was howling against the windows. I was a 71-year-old man, completely erased by the system, left out in the cold with nowhere to sleep and no one to turn to. But as I turned the ignition key to start the heater, a slow, dangerous clarity washed over me. They thought I was just a retired contractor with a valuable old house and a modest pension. They thought they had taken everything. They had absolutely no idea who they were messing with. I drove away from the sanctuary I had called home for 30 years. A layer of frost was forming on the streets, matching the steel-hard resolve hardening in my mind. With only $42 to my name, my options were incredibly limited. I headed toward the industrial outskirts of the city, pulling into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a rundown roadside motel. I paid the night clerk $35 in cash for a room that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and damp carpet. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, still wearing my heavy wool coat because the room's heater was broken. The phone on the cheap laminate nightstand vibrated. The caller ID showed Lucas's name. I let it ring 3 times, controlling my breathing before I picked up. "Dad, where are you?" Lucas's voice came through the speaker, carrying an exaggerated, sickening anxiety. "You left so suddenly. Valerie is absolutely hysterical thinking you got lost on the drive home. We're worried sick." I closed my eyes. The performance was completely transparent. He wasn't calling out of concern for my safety. He was establishing a timeline. He wanted me to sound incoherent on a recorded line, or better yet, admit that I was wandering aimlessly. It was all part of the narrative they were building to legally prove I had cognitive decline. They needed a record of erratic behavior to justify the moving trucks currently clearing out my house and the conservatorship order. "I'm fine, son," I replied, my voice steady, completely drained of emotion. I just felt incredibly tired after that heavy dinner. I didn't want to risk driving exhausted, so I pulled over and got a motel room by the highway to rest for the night. I'll head home in the morning. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. He was surprised by how sharp I sounded. A motel? Dad, see, this is exactly why Valerie says you need supervision. You shouldn't be staying in strange places. Just tell me where you are and I'll come pick you up right now. We can go back to your place and get you settled in. He wanted to know if I had been back to the house yet. He was fishing to see if the surprise had been ruined. I let out a cold, silent laugh in the dark, empty room. Don't worry about me, Lucas. Go to sleep. Tell Valerie thank you for her concern. I hung up the phone and flipped it face down on the desk. They thought they had backed a frail old man into a dead end. They had no idea they had just given me the perfect opportunity to launch a surprise attack. The gray, cold light of morning filtered through the dirty blinds. I washed my face in the rusty sink, buttoned my coat, and left my remaining $7 on the nightstand as a tip for the housekeeper. I had no time to waste on corporate phone operators hiding behind scripted customer service lines. I didn't bother going to my local brokerage branch. Instead, I drove straight to the Boston Financial District and walked into the law offices of Marcus Reed. Marcus wasn't just a lawyer. He was a corporate shark, a man who had built his entire career on tearing apart hostile takeovers and burying financial predators. Years ago, when Eleanor and I liquidated our commercial real estate holdings, Marcus was the architect who built an unbreakable legal fortress around our true wealth. When I walked into his panoramic corner office overlooking the freezing city, he didn't offer empty platitudes or condescending sympathy. Instead, the moment I sat down, he slid a thick black leather folder across his polished mahogany desk. The second we hung up last night, I put my investigative team on your son and daughter-in-law, Marcus said, leaning back in his leather chair, his sharp eyes locking onto mine. It didn't take long to find the rot beneath the floorboards. They are bleeding cash, Arthur. That lavish lifestyle, the imported sports cars, the suburban mansion where you ate dinner last night. It's all a fragile house of cards built on suffocating, inescapable debt. I opened the folder, my hands steady. The numbers printed on the crisp, white paper were staggering. How bad is the damage? I asked, my voice completely level. Marcus tapped the desk with a heavy silver pen. They are in a hole to the tune of $3 million. Lucas's logistics startup is completely dead, and he signed a personal bridge loan with unlimited liability. He defaulted 3 months ago, and the venture capital sharks are closing in. And Valerie, to cover Lucas's losses, has been quietly skimming off the dividend distributions of her high-net-worth elderly clients. The SEC and their firm's internal end-of-year compliance audit are happening next week. They aren't just taking your money to go on a vacation. They desperately need cash from an emergency, under-the-market sale of your unmortgaged Back Bay townhouse to patch up the public funds she embezzled before Christmas. It's the only way they can save themselves from total bankruptcy and federal felony charges. The pathetic reality of my son's life was laid bare right in front of me. He had sold his soul, his father, and his family legacy just to keep up appearances for a wife who viewed him as nothing more than a failed investment. They were literally liquidating my dignity and my home to pay for their disastrous financial decisions. We have more than enough hard evidence right now to go straight to the authorities, Marcus said, leaning forward, his tone turning deadly serious. Valerie draining your accounts using forged medical documents is federal wire fraud. We can file an emergency injunction, freeze her accounts, and have the cops arrest both of them for elder abuse and financial fraud before sunset. Let me loose, Arthur. I will completely ruin them, and I'll make sure neither of them ever gets a bank loan or a decent job for the rest of their lives. I stared at those damning financial documents, running my thumb along the sharp edge of the paper. No, I replied, my voice as cold as the winter wind outside. We aren't going to the police. Not yet. Marcus frowned, clearly frustrated by my restraint. Arthur, they are tearing your home down to the studs as we speak. If we don't file for an emergency injunction today, that house will hit the black market by tomorrow morning. If we file for an injunction, I countered, looking Marcus straight in the eye, Valerie will play her ace She has a court-ordered medical conservatorship. She works in finance, and she knows exactly how to manipulate the legal and medical systems. If I walk into a courtroom tomorrow, claiming my son and his wife are stealing my money, Valerie will immediately call that bought-off psychiatrist. She will point to my anger and claim I'm having a severe episode of paranoia and violent dementia. They will have me involuntarily committed. I'll be locked in a sterile white room, heavily medicated and forced to shut up. Meanwhile, you'll spend months fighting an incredibly passive, deeply corrupt legal battle. By the time I finally get out, the house will be sold, the money laundered through offshore accounts, and the damage will be irreversible. Marcus slowly set his pen down, understanding the brutal tactical reality of what I was saying. She's banking on your predictable outrage, he pointed out. She expects you to fight back publicly and aggressively so she can legally put you in a psychiatric straitjacket. Exactly, I said. So we don't fight back publicly. We let them think they've won. We let them believe I am exactly what they want me to be, a broken, helpless old man who has surrendered to his miserable fate. But in the dark, Marcus, I want you to start quietly buying up their debt. Contact the venture capital firms and predatory lenders they owe money to. Do not let them know who is buying the debt. I want to become their absolute sole financial master. I want to silently cut off their oxygen supply so they don't even realize they're suffocating until their lungs are on fire. I'm choosing financial assassination. A rare, dangerous smile flashed across Marcus's stern face. Eleanor always said you were the most terrifyingly patient man she've ever met. He snapped the black folder shut. I'll wake up the ghost trust. Eleanor and I never cared about the spotlight or validation from strangers. Decades ago, as my contracting business grew, we secretly channeled every spare dollar into buying up bankrupt, abandoned industrial warehouses and logistics centers around Chicago and Boston. We rezoned them, renovated them, made them highly profitable, and eventually sold the entire portfolio to e-commerce giants for a massive fortune. 15 years ago, we put a full $12 million into a blind trust that wouldn't show up on any standard background check, tax return, or credit report. We drove old cars and lived in the same modest but expensive townhouse because we understood a fundamental truth about this world. Flashy wealth only invites predators, but invisible wealth makes you absolutely invincible. Valerie and Lucas thought they were playing chess against an ignorant blue-collar old man. They had no idea they had just declared war on a king with unlimited resources. When I left Marcus's office, my heart was armored in ice, and a clear, devastating plan had formed in my mind. I stopped at a cheap discount store on the edge of town and bought a battered, inexpensive suitcase, stuffing it with a few basic changes of clothes. I sat in my car for a while, messing up my hair and letting my shoulders slouch, practicing the trembling, defeated posture of an old man who had lost everything. I had to bury my pride to guarantee total victory. As the sun sank below the horizon, casting cold shadows across the manicured suburban lawns, I drove back to Lucas's wealthy neighborhood. I parked 2 blocks away to stay hidden, picked up that pathetic suitcase, and walked slowly up his winding concrete driveway. My heart wasn't beating out of fear or sadness, it thumping with the methodical, calculated rhythm of a predator closing in on its prey. I shuffled up the porch steps, raised my hand, and knocked softly on the heavy oak door, ready to walk straight into the snake's den. The door swung open, and Lucas stood there, bathed in the warm golden light of the foyer. When his eyes landed on me, standing on his porch with a hunched back, holding a battered suitcase, shivering in the freezing wind, the color completely drained from his face, I opened my eyes wide, forcing an expression of utter confusion and vulnerability. I let my jaw go slack and allowed my hands to shake violently in the cold air. "Lucas," I rasped, keeping my voice thin and frightened. "I went home, but there are strangers there. My house is empty. I don't know where my keys are. I didn't know where else to go." Lucas swallowed hard. Guilt flashed across his face, but it was immediately replaced by pure panic. He glanced back over his shoulder. Dad, I... Before he could invent a pathetic excuse, Valerie appeared in the hallway, holding a glass of white wine. Her sharp blue eyes narrowed the second she saw me. There wasn't a shred of sympathy in her gaze, only a deep, visceral disgust. She looked at me the way someone looks at a stray dog tracking mud onto an expensive white carpet. She strode to the door, yanked Lucas to the side, and hissed a loud accusation meant for me to hear. "What is he doing here? You said the psychiatric transport van was going to pick him up from the motel this morning." "He looks completely lost, Valerie," Lucas whispered back, his voice trembling. "We can't just leave him out on the porch in the freezing cold. The neighbors will see." Valerie sighed dramatically and rolled her eyes, as if carrying the heaviest burden in the world. She stepped forward, switching back into that sickeningly sweet, condescending voice. "Oh, Arthur, you poor man. Your memory must be playing tricks on you again. We sold that big, drafty old house for your own good. Come inside before you catch pneumonia." I shuffled across the threshold, leaning heavily against the doorframe. I expected to be led to one of the 3 flawless guest rooms on the 2nd floor, but instead Valerie walked right past the grand staircase and opened a narrow, reinforced door right next to the kitchen pantry. "The guest rooms are being renovated right now," she lied smoothly, not even bothering to make it sound believable. "You'll have to stay down here tonight. It's safer this way anyway. No stairs for you to fall down." She flipped a switch. A flickering bare bulb illuminated an unfinished, windowless freezing pool equipment and storage basement. The air was thick with heavy moisture and a sharp, musty smell of mold. The concrete floor was ice cold, and the only piece of furniture was a rusty metal folding bed with a thin, stained mattress pushed against the far wall. It was a space meant for piling up discarded cardboard boxes, not for a human being. It was a prison cell. Lucas stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at the miserable bed. He opened his mouth, maybe to object, but Valerie shut him down with a single icy glare. He immediately looked away, staring hard at his expensive leather shoes. "Get some sleep, Arthur," Valerie said cheerfully. "We'll have your permanent care facility sorted out first thing tomorrow." She slammed the door shut, plunging me into the damp, isolated silence. From the outside, the heavy thud of a deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the wood. She had actually locked me in the basement. I stood there in the middle of that frigid concrete floor, and I completely dropped the act. No more shaking, no more faking. I stood up straight, rolled my shoulders, and let all that tension from the performance just melt away. They thought they had me trapped down there. They had no idea I'd already breached their perimeter. I waited in absolute silence for 3 hours. I just sat on the edge of that pathetic little cot, listening to the muffled footsteps directly above me until the whole house finally settled into that deep, heavy quiet of late night. At 2 a.m., I made my move. I reached into my cheap suitcase and pulled out a small professional leather pouch that Marcus's security team had slipped me earlier that afternoon. Inside was a state-of-the-art miniature audio transmitter, no bigger than a quarter, capable of broadcasting crystal-clear audio directly to an encrypted app on my phone. Using a piece of fine wire I'd pulled from one of the springs in the cot, I expertly picked the cheap deadbolt lock on the basement door in under 30 seconds. Decades of construction and engineering experience means I know the intricate mechanics of old locks, inside and out. I slipped out of the basement, moving through their dark, cavernous mansion like a ghost, with a silent, predatory grace. I avoided the floorboards in the hallway that I knew would creak and made my way into Valerie's home office. From Marcus's dossier, I knew Valerie always conducted her most sensitive, shady business calls at this massive glass desk in the early mornings, long before Lucas even opened his eyes. I crawled underneath the desk and pressed the adhesive side of the wiretap deep into the recess beneath the drawer, where absolutely no one would ever feel or see it. Then I slipped back into the basement, relocked the door from the inside, and waited. The payoff came much faster than I expected. At 6 a.m., my phone vibrated in the darkness. I put on my wireless earbuds and activated the listening app. Valerie's sharp, impatient voice came through, incredibly clear. She was on a call. Vince, I do not care what the standard market listing price is right now, Valerie hissed, her voice low and frantic. I need that Back Bay property liquidated immediately. No inspections, no bank appraisals, no public listing. I need an all-cash buyer, and I need this deal closed by next Friday. A man's gravelly voice came over the speakerphone, requesting a cash closing on a property that size in under a week. That requires finding someone who will absolutely not ask questions. Valerie, my buyer is going to require a brutal discount, and I'm going to need a substantial kickback to expedite this shady mess. Think at least 40% below market value. Done, Valerie interrupted without a second of hesitation. Take whatever cut you need on the buyer's end. Just get me $2 million in clean, untraceable cash by next Friday, wire transferred to the offshore account I sent you. My father-in-law's signature is already on the conservatorship papers. The old fool doesn't even know what day of the week it is. Just get it done before the SEC auditors find the hole in my personal accounts. I recorded every single second of that audio directly to my secure cloud server. She was conspiring to commit egregious real estate fraud, intentionally selling off extremely valuable assets for far below market value to evade federal banking oversight and move cash to an offshore account to save her own skin. She was leaving a trail of digital breadcrumbs a mile long, enough to ensure she spent a very, very long time in federal prison. As soon as that call ended, I heard another set of footsteps walk into the office upstairs. It was Lucas. His voice came through my earbuds, weak and hesitant. Valerie, are you sure about Vince? Lucas asked softly. Selling Dad's house under the table for cash just feels incredibly risky. If the bank finds out, or if Dad somehow figures it out. Your father is sitting in a freezing basement talking to the wall. Valerie cut him off viciously. If you want to keep your imported sports cars, your country club membership, and save face for your failing company, you will shut your mouth and let the adults handle the business. If we don't have this cash by Friday, we are homeless, Lucas. Do you understand that? Yes, Valerie, I understand, Lucas mumbled, sounding completely defeated. Listening to that conversation, the last agonizing shred of sympathy I had left for my son just snapped deep inside me. I realized my son wasn't some passive victim of manipulation. He was a willing, cowardly accomplice. He was trading his father's life for his wife's approval. He was gone, and I no longer had any desire to save him. I needed to gather a bit more intel on where Valerie was hiding the physical bank ledgers. I waited until I heard Lucas leave for work and Valerie head upstairs to take a shower, then picked the basement lock again and quietly made my way to the first floor. Just in case, I resumed my hunched, confused posture as I approached Valerie's home office. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and saw a stack of overdue loan payment demands and internal bank legal papers scattered across her immaculate glass desktop. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the damning evidence of their financial ruin. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked directly behind me. What exactly do you think you're looking at? Valerie's voice sliced through the silence like a whip cracking the air, making my blood freeze instantly. I froze, my back to her, using that split second to reset my face. I forced my shoulders to slouch, let my hands begin to tremble, and slowly turned around. I stared at her with wide, vacant eyes, giving her exactly what she expected. I was just looking for the bathroom, I mumbled, my voice practiced, raspy and confused. The hallway was so dark I got lost. Valerie didn't relax her guard. She walked fully into the office, her eyes darting between my face and the overdue loan notices, fully exposed on the desktop. She was a predator, and she could smell danger. She took a step closer, her gaze deadly as she scrutinized my posture. You are not lost, Arthur, she said, dropping her voice to a chillingly calm, low whisper. I see it in your eyes. You know exactly what you're looking at. I kept my vacant expression, but my silence was all the confirmation she needed. A sudden sharp panic flashed across her pristine features. If I was lucid, if I understood the depth of their financial collapse, I could ruin the illegal cash deal she was about to make. I could just walk out the front door, take a cab to the police station, and report her for elder abuse and wire fraud. She needed to completely neutralize me, right now, and it needed to have absolute, unquestionable legal force. I watched her calculating mind racing. She looked at the heavy glass door of the office, then back at me. Finally, her gaze landed on a sleek, silver letter opener sitting next to the keyboard. What happened next was so fast, so completely unhinged, that it took all of my willpower not to fight back. Valerie grabbed the heavy silver blade. She stared me dead in the eye, a twisted, desperate smile appearing on her face, staining the cuff of her expensive white silk blouse. She dropped the bloody letter opener onto the floor, right at my feet. I stood perfectly still. I knew exactly what she was doing, and I knew that if I tried to stop her, or if I picked up that blade, my fingerprints would seal my fate. She grabbed her phone with her good hand and dialed 911. The moment the operator answered, Valerie completely transformed. The cold, calculating investment manager was gone, replaced by a hysterical, terrified victim. "Help me!" she screamed into the phone, her voice cracking with manufactured terror. "Please send the police right now. My father-in-law has severe dementia. He's having a violent episode. He broke into my office and attacked me with a knife. He doesn't even know who I am. Please, there's so much blood. Hurry." She threw the phone down, letting it clatter onto the glass desktop so the operator would hear her continuing to sob loudly. She collapsed onto the floor, clutching her bleeding arm, rocking back and forth. "You old bastard! You're going to spend the rest of your life dying in a padded cell for this," she hissed viciously at me through the fake tears. I didn't say a single word. I just memorized this moment of pure depravity. 10 minutes later, screaming sirens shattered the quiet suburban morning. Tires squealed on the driveway, heavy boots hammered onto the porch. The front door was thrown open, and 3 police officers rushed into the hallway, hands on their holsters. Lucas arrived only seconds later, rushing through the door in his tailored work suit, obviously having received a call from his frantic wife. He stopped at the entrance to the home office, completely paralyzed. The scene perfectly set the stage for my destruction. Valerie was curled up in the corner, sobbing uncontrollably, clutching her bleeding arm. I was standing in the middle of the room, looking down at the bloody letter opener at my feet. "Secure the suspect," the lead officer snapped. 2 young officers rushed forward, grabbing my arms and twisting them violently behind my back. They didn't care that I was a 71-year-old man. They just saw a violent attacker standing over a bleeding woman. The cold metal handcuffs bit into my wrists, clicking shut with brutal finality. "Oh my God, Valerie!" Lucas screamed, rushing over to his wife and falling to his knees. "What happened?" "He attacked me, Lucas," Valerie sobbed, burying her face into his chest. "He just charged into the office, rambling incoherently. He didn't know who I was. He grabbed the letter opener and just started swinging. I was so scared." The lead officer pulled out a notepad, his harsh gaze turning to my son. "Sir, does your father suffer from cognitive decline? Does he have any history of violent outbursts?" I looked straight at Lucas. I looked at the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the boy I had stayed up with helping with math homework, the boy my sweat and blood had provided for his entire life. This was the defining moment. He knew his wife was a manipulator. He knew I had never been violent a day in my life. He looked at Valerie's bleeding arm. Then he looked at the police. Finally, he looked at me. "Yes," Lucas said, his voice shaking, but the words were devastatingly clear. "He's been suffering from severe dementia for months. He's completely confused lately. We were actually trying to find a secure medical facility for him. He must have just snapped. He had verbally signed my execution order. He chose his wife's insane lie and traded his father's freedom." The officer nodded, scribbling quickly in his notepad. "Based on the physical evidence at the scene and your statements, sir, we are taking him in immediately. Given the allegations involve domestic violence and the danger he poses, an emergency temporary restraining order is now in effect. He is legally barred from this property, barred from contact with your wife, and must remain at least 500 feet from you both." They dragged me out of the office. I walked with my head high, refusing to stagger, refusing to give Valerie the satisfaction of seeing me break. I didn't look back as the police marched me through the front door, down the driveway, and toward the flashing lights of the patrol car. I didn't need to look back. I knew the wiretap was still firmly taped under their dining room table, silently capturing their every move. The police took me to the local precinct. Because of my age, my clean criminal record, and the lack of prior psychiatric history, the desk captain decided against formally placing me in a holding cell. Instead, after booking me, they handed me a copy of the emergency restraining order and gave me a severe warning about returning to my son's property. Then they dumped my cheap suitcase on the sidewalk outside the station and left me there. I stood alone on the cold cement outside the precinct. The biting winter wind whipped at my coat. The physical cold couldn't even touch the absolute gaping void in my chest. The bond between a father and son is supposed to be sacred. It's supposed to be the one anchor in a chaotic world. But standing on that concrete, I felt that anchor shatter completely. Lucas had chosen his side. He had watched them handcuff me based on a fabricated lie, and he had helped them tighten the metal chains. A single hot tear spilled over, tracking down my weathered cheek. It wasn't a tear of self-pity. It was a tear for Eleanor. It was a tear mourning the death of the boy we had loved so deeply. It was an admission that the son we raised was officially gone. I lifted my hand and wiped the water from my face. That was it. That was going to be the very last tear I ever shed for Lucas Vance. The mourning period was officially over. I picked up that cheap suitcase and walked 3 blocks to the commercial parking garage where I'd hidden my car the night before. I unlocked the door, sat in the driver's seat, and started the engine, letting the heater melt my frozen hands. The phase of playing the helpless victim was dead. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my wallet. I skipped right over the empty slots where my stolen credit cards used to be. Instead, I dug my fingernail deep into a hidden reinforced seam in the back of the wallet. I pulled out a heavy matte black metal bank card. There was no corporate logo on it, no bank name, and no card number visible. It just had a single secure gold chip and my name printed in minimalist silver letters. This was the master key to the Ghost Trust. This was an instrument of absolute financial destruction, and I hadn't touched it in over 10 years. I stared at that heavy piece of metal in my hand, feeling the immense, crushing power it represented. Valerie wanted to ruin my life with a single piece of paper. Well, I was going to erase hers completely with a single piece of metal. I slid the matte black card back into my wallet and shifted the car into gear. I drove away from that police station, leaving the morning's humiliation behind me. My destination wasn't some typical retail bank with a drive-through window and tellers smiling while they handed out pamphlets. I drove straight into the city's financial heart and parked in front of a massive, imposing limestone building that occupied an entire city block. There were no flashing neon signs here, just a discreet brass plaque next to the thick bulletproof glass doors. This was Vanguard Private Wealth Management, an institution that did not serve the public. You couldn't just walk in here to open an account. You had to be invited by the board, and the minimum deposit threshold just to set foot in this building was $10 million in liquid assets. I parked by the curb and walked toward the entrance. 2 massive security guards in tailored, dark suits eyed my scuffed boots and faded wool coat. I saw the immediate contempt register in their eyes. They stepped forward to block my path, probably assuming I was just an old man who had gotten lost trying to find the bus stop. I didn't say a word. I just reached into my pocket and held up the black metal card. Both security guards froze in place. Their posture immediately shifted from intimidation to absolute deference. They stepped to the side, quickly holding open the heavy glass doors for me. The lobby inside was a sanctuary of hushed whispers, polished marble floors, and dark walnut paneling. A well-dressed executive director immediately started walking toward me. "Welcome back, Mr. Vance," he said, his voice dropping to a respectful whisper. "It has been a very long time. We have your private suite prepared for you." He escorted me deep into the building to a soundproofed windowless room, handed me an encrypted tablet, and then backed out, leaving me completely alone. I entered my biometric data and typed in the complex alphanumeric password that Eleanor and I had memorized together decades ago. The screen loaded, displaying the current balance of the Ghost Trust, $12,412,000. I stared at that astonishing number and felt my wife's spirit standing right there with me in that quiet room. We hadn't inherited this fortune. We built it from the mud up. Decades ago, while everyone else was using credit to buy flashy suburban houses and luxury cars, Eleanor and I were secretly purchasing a chain of bankrupt logistics warehouses along emerging commercial highways. We renovated them, worked 20-hour days, and eventually sold the entire, highly profitable asset chain to a national corporation. We buried that massive cash payoff right here in this blind trust. We chose to live like average working-class people because we understood one fundamental truth. True financial power is completely invisible. Now that invisible force was fully awake, ready to strike with devastating force. I tapped the screen, authorizing an immediate transfer of $300,000 to a newly created, untraceable offshore business checking account. I walked out of that bank feeling a profound, deadly sense of peace. I drove straight back to the glass skyscraper where Marcus Reed's office was. I bypassed the receptionist and walked right into his corner office. I unlocked the trust, I told him, throwing the new business checkbook onto his polished mahogany desk. Now I want you to hire the most ruthless corporate espionage and investigation firm in this city. I don't want cheap private investigators sitting in parked cars taking blurry photos. I want digital forensics experts. I want ex-federal agents, the kind who know exactly how to completely dissect a corrupt bank executive. Marcus didn't hesitate for a single second. He picked up his secure phone and made one call. Less than 2 hours later, we were sitting in a sterile, secure conference room across from three men in sharp, tailored suits. They were top-tier predators in the world of intelligence, specializing in corporate fraud investigations, digital tracking, and total financial destruction. The lead investigator, a man with cold, clinical eyes named Vince, opened his laptop. "Who's the target?" he asked. "Her name is Valerie Vance," I stated, sliding the picture of my daughter-in-law across the massive conference table. "She's a senior wealth manager at Horizon Wealth Management. She thinks she's untouchable because she knows how to manipulate bureaucratic loopholes. I want you to tear her professional life apart on a microscopic level. I want her work emails, her internal chat logs, her trade history, and her deleted files. I want every digital footprint she's left for the past 5 years. She's trying to execute an under-the-table, all-cash black market sale of my property right now to cover up massive personal debt. If she's bold enough to commit felonies like elder abuse and forgery of legal documents in broad daylight, I guarantee you she's hiding darker secrets in the shadow of her executive position." Vince looked at the picture, then looked up at me. "Bypassing commercial bank firewalls and deep diving into encrypted files of senior executives is complex. This is going to be incredibly expensive, Mr. Vance." "I do not care what it costs," I replied, my voice level, completely devoid of mercy. "You have a blank check. Get the job done, no matter what it takes. I want her completely exposed, and I want it done before she finalizes the sale on my house." The investigators immediately packed up their gear and went to work with cold, professional efficiency. I left the building and used a corporate alias, provided by Marcus, to check into an ultra-luxury, high-security penthouse suite that prized privacy above all else. Sitting on a leather sofa overlooking the sprawling city skyline, I poured myself a glass of aged bourbon and reflected on the sheer, pathetic irony of my son's existence. Lucas and Valerie were the perfect embodiment of modern flashy debt. They drove imported luxury cars they didn't own, wore designer clothing bought on high-interest credit cards, projecting an image of supreme, invincible wealth, while simultaneously suffocating under a mountain of unpaid bills. They measured their entire worth solely by what others could see. Eleanor and I had chosen the opposite path. We understood that quiet wealth was the only real wealth. Quiet wealth doesn't need to show off, and it doesn't seek validation. It waits patiently in the dark, accumulating massive power, ready to be deployed with devastating force at the exact moment it's needed. Valerie thought that draining that measly $150,000 using her credentials was enough to crush a helpless old man. She imagined herself a financial genius. She had absolutely no idea she had just declared war on a man who could buy her entire wealthy neighborhood in cash and still have millions left over. For the next 48 hours, I waited in absolute silence. I didn't contact Lucas. I completely ignored the vicious text messages Valerie was sending to my phone, demanding I sign more medical waivers or face permanent institutionalization. I just stared out the window of the penthouse suite at the city lights, letting the trap slowly tighten around them. On the morning of the third day, there was a measured, sharp knock on the door of my penthouse. I opened it to find Vince standing in the hallway. He was holding a thick, encrypted flash drive and a heavy red manila folder. He wasn't smiling. He looked at me with a gaze that was a mix of professional awe and cold satisfaction. "You were absolutely right about her, Mr. Vance," Vince said, walking into the room and tossing the heavy folder onto the glass coffee table. "The contents of this file are not just professional misconduct. This is massive, systemic, predatory fraud. We found exactly what she was hiding, and it's enough to send your daughter-in-law to federal prison for a very, very long time." I opened the heavy red folder. The thick cardstock felt surprisingly light, considering the absolute destructive power it contained inside. The top document was an internal bank ledger, covered in jarring red highlights, complex routing numbers, and flagged transaction codes. Vince leaned over the glass coffee table, his steady finger pointing to a set of offshore transfer records dating back 18 months. "Valerie wasn't just a terrible daughter-in-law, Mr. Vance," Vince explained, his voice low and clinical. "She's an active, calculating predator. For years, she has been specifically targeting elderly clients at Horizon Wealth Management. We tracked her digital footprints. She specifically looked for clients with early-onset dementia, or those with no immediate family actively monitoring their monthly statements." Vince flipped a page, revealing a disturbing pattern of forged authorizations and internal bank memos. "She set up complex automated transfer algorithms," Vince continued. "She skimmed thousands of dollars out of these vulnerable accounts every single month, running the money through a maze of shell corporations before it finally landed in her personal offshore holding accounts. If a victim noticed a discrepancy, she would gaslight them, claiming it was just some standard administrative fee or tax that they'd forgotten about themselves. The sheer level of her cruelty made my jaw tighten. She was a monster, pure and simple, wrapped in a tailored pantsuit. "But she got sloppy," Vince said, pointing at a particularly damning spreadsheet. 2 months ago, her greed got the best of her. She pulled a massive chunk of cash out of a high-net-worth estate account to cover the skyrocketing interest on Lucas's failed startup loans. It was a rookie mistake. Now, the firm just announced a surprise, full-blown year-end compliance audit for early December. The SEC is getting involved, too. Valerie is currently sitting on a $2 million black hole in her ledgers. Every single piece of the puzzle clicked together with sickening clarity. The rush to sell my house for under-the-table cash to a shady realtor, the sudden ambush on Christmas Eve to disorient me, the forged medical guardianship. None of it was ever about funding her luxury lifestyle or buying designer clothes. This was a desperate, panicked run for survival. She needed that dirty cash from my house to plug the massive hole in her corporate books before the federal auditors showed up to dissect her files. She was literally planning to sacrifice my life, my freedom, and my home to buy herself a get-out-of-jail-free card. Vince closed the folder and looked straight at me. "The digital evidence we have right here is enough to trigger a massive federal indictment. We could CC this entire file to the FBI's white-collar crime division tonight. They'd raid her office by tomorrow morning. Do you want me to make the call? I stared at that red folder for a long moment, listening to the distant hum of city traffic outside the penthouse windows. Handing this over to the authorities right now is too easy on them, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, steady calm. She goes to prison, but Lucas gets to play the innocent and betrayed husband. He walks away scot-free, claiming he had absolutely no idea his wife was a criminal mastermind. He files for bankruptcy and escapes the consequences of his own cowardice. I watched him stand by and let the cops put handcuffs on me. I watched him sell out his own father for a woman who uses him as a shield. I want them both trapped in the cage they built together. I picked up the secure phone and dialed Marcus Reed. My attorney answered on the very first ring. "Marcus," I said, "I want to talk about my son's debt. You mentioned before that because of his failed business venture, he owes roughly $3 million, mostly to aggressive subprime venture lenders and predatory credit agencies." "Exactly," Marcus replied, his tone instantly shifting into pure legal strategy mode. The bridge loans from Lucas's startup failure and the massive second mortgage on his house were bundled and sold to a series of aggressive debt collection firms. They hold liens on his imported luxury cars, his personal assets, and whatever equity is left in his home. "I want to buy it," I commanded, my eyes locked on the glittering city skyline. "Buy every single penny of it. Set up a blind shell company. Call it Eleanor Holdings. Use the funds from the phantom trusts. Even if you have to pay a premium, I want exclusive, undisputed ownership of all his financial obligations by tomorrow morning. I want the legal right to repossess his vehicles, garnish his wages, and seize his remaining assets the exact second he defaults." Marcus let out a low, dark chuckle on the other end of the line. "A hostile financial takeover of your own son. That is beautifully cutthroat, Arthur. By purchasing the debt through a masked LLC, Lucas will just think his loans were bought out by some anonymous, cold-blooded corporate creditor. He will have absolutely no idea that the man holding the leash, the man who legally owns his entire existence on paper, is the very father he locked in a freezing basement. I'll have my acquisition team finalize the purchase agreements before sunrise." I ended the call, thanked Vince for his incredible work, and told the investigators to head home for the night. Left alone in the vast, luxurious penthouse, I poured myself a small glass of water and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows. After 40 years as a commercial contractor, I learned an absolute truth about pressure from high-voltage systems. When a pipe is severely damaged, when the rot is deep inside the system, you don't just patch the surface and walk away. You let the pressure build, you watch the microscopic cracks spread, and you let the system push itself to the absolute edge of disaster. Then, when the tension is at its absolute maximum, you turn the main valve and let the whole structure violently collapse under its own weight. I had the meticulous financial patience to wait for that exact moment. For the next 24 hours, I operated in absolute silence, watching this digital chess game unfold from the safety of the penthouse. Marcus's legal team executed the debt purchase flawlessly. For just a few $1,000s in premium acquisition fees, Eleanor Holdings officially became Lucas Vance's sole creditor. My son was now my property. Meanwhile, my bank alerts confirmed that Valerie was frantically trying to push through the shady appraisal on my home, rushing the fraudulent sale to secure her stolen cash. They thought they were sprinting toward the finish line, completely blind to the brick wall I had just built right in front of them. But just as the ink was drying on the final signature for my son's financial death warrant, my encrypted secure phone vibrated violently against the marble kitchen counter. I had intentionally kept my old number active, just to see if Lucas would have the guts to call me. I checked the screen. It was an unknown number, but the second I answered, I instantly recognized the frantic, breathless voice. "Mr. Vance?" the voice whispered, trembling with sheer terror. "It's David, from Investment Banking Compliance. The David who called you on Christmas Eve." I straightened up, my senses instantly on high alert. "David," I replied calmly. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you again. Valerie has completely lost it." David stammered, his words crashing into each other in a panic. She's forcing me to digitally forge loan approvals to cover up her missing funds. She told me if I don't comply, she'll frame my employee ID for the missing $2 million and have the police arrest me. I can't go to the cops, and I can't go to the bank managers because she has them all fooled. Please, Mr. Vance, I know what she did to your accounts. I know she stole your pension. I need to meet you right now. My life is in danger, and you're the only person who knows what she's truly capable of. I gave David an address to a greasy 24-hour diner on the industrial edge of the city. It was a place with flickering fluorescent lights and air that smelled like old grease and burnt coffee. It was the last place an investment banking executive in a tailored suit would ever step foot in. I arrived 30 minutes early, sitting in the booth furthest in the back, facing the entrance. Right at 11 o'clock, the bell above the diner door chimed. David walked in. He was a young guy, barely out of his 20s, but he looked like he had aged 10 years in a week. His tie was undone, his shirt was wrinkled, his eyes were bloodshot, and he scanned the room frantically like a hunted animal. He spotted me and practically collapsed into the vinyl booth across the table. He didn't ask for a menu. He just stared at me, his hands shaking so violently that he had to press them flat against the sticky tabletop. "Mr. Vance," David whispered, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds, as if Valerie might materialize out of the kitchen. "I'm so sorry to drag you into this, but you're the only one who knows what she's capable of. She's completely unhinged. The corporate audit starts in less than a week, and she's backed into a corner." I slid a mug of black coffee toward him. "Breathe, David. Panic is a useless emotion. It only makes you make mistakes. Tell me exactly what my daughter-in-law wants you to do." David took a desperate gulp of the scalding coffee, wincing but grateful for the reality check. "She's trying to build a firewall out of my career," he explained, his voice raspy with desperation. "The auditors are going to find that $2 million deficit on her books. She knows she can't hide the missing money anymore. So this afternoon she pulled me into her office, locked the door, and gave me an ultimatum. She wants me to use my junior security credentials to authorize 3 fake bridge loans. These loans are designed to temporarily inject enough capital into the flagged accounts to make the ledgers look perfectly balanced right when the federal compliance officers run their scans. I leaned back against the vinyl seat, digesting her incredibly vicious strategy. She wants you to leave the digital footprint for the fraud. I cut straight to the trap. David nodded miserably, tears of sheer frustration welling up in his eyes. "Yes. The second the audit is over, those phantom loans will inevitably default. But by then the auditors are gone, and the blame falls entirely on the junior analyst who processed the paperwork, me. If I refuse, she swore she'd fire me tomorrow morning for gross insubordination and flag my financial license for suspicious activity. I'll be blacklisted and never work in finance again. But if I do it, when those loans default, the FBI will trace the IP address straight to my desk. I'll take the fall for her embezzlement, I'll go to federal prison, and she gets to play the shocked, disappointed supervisor. Valerie wasn't just a thief. She was a parasite. She was entirely willing to destroy a young man's whole life just to buy herself a few more months of freedom. I looked at the terrified kid across from me. He was drowning, completely paralyzed by the massive weight of corporate leverage. He thought he was trapped in a no-win scenario. He had no idea that the man sitting across from him owned the entire chessboard they were playing on. I reached inside my heavy wool overcoat and pulled out a thick-sealed manila envelope. I slid it across the sticky table. David stared at it like it was a bomb. "Open it," I instructed calmly. His trembling fingers tore the seal. Inside was a comprehensive legal representation agreement drafted by Marcus Reed's law firm. It was tailored specifically for the Whistleblower Protection Division, already stamped with a full retainer paid by Eleanor Holdings. Attached to the contract was a cashier's check for $50,000, meant to cover David's immediate living expenses in case of a wrongful termination. David looked up at me, his mouth half open in absolute shock. Mr. Vance, I don't understand. How can you afford a firm like Marcus Reed? This is top-tier corporate defense. I'm full of surprises, I replied flatly. But legal protection is just a shield, David. We need a sword. I reached into my pocket again and pulled out a small, sleek device that looked exactly like a standard car key fob. It was actually a military-grade digital extraction drive given to me earlier today by Vince's corporate espionage team. I set it down gently right next to his coffee cup. Here's what you're going to do, I said, leaning forward with absolute authority. Tomorrow morning, you walk into that firm. You act terrified. You let her bully you. You sit down at your terminal and you agree to process those phantom loans exactly the way she wants. David swallowed hard, his eyes wide. But Mr. Vance, if I process them, I leave a digital trail. I'm guilty. You're only guilty if she controls the narrative, I countered. Before you execute her orders, you plug this key fob into the back of your terminal. It runs a silent, undetectable cloning program. It will record your terminal screen, capture every single keystroke, duplicate the internal routing data, and most importantly, extract the digital authorization override codes she uses to force the system to accept the transactions. It will prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that these commands were initiated under executive duress from her. You give her exactly what she's asking for, and in doing so, you hand me the smoking gun that puts her away for a decade. David stared at the small black device. The fear in his eyes began to melt away, replaced by a slow, dawning realization. He wasn't a helpless victim anymore. He was a weapon. He looked at me, seeing right past the faded wool coat and my blue-collar demeanor. "Who exactly are you, Mr. Vance?" David asked, his voice suddenly thick with a deep newfound respect. "I'm the guy who's about to burn her kingdom to the ground," I told him. "Take the drive. Follow my instructions perfectly. Call Marcus Reed first thing in the morning. He'll handle your federal immunity paperwork." David stuffed the device and the legal documents into his briefcase, thanked me a dozen times, and rushed out of the diner, vanishing into the freezing night. I stayed in the booth for a little while longer, sipping the bitter coffee and reflecting on the massive blast radius of Valerie's greed. Some criminals are driven by desperate necessity, but Valerie was driven by an extreme pathological sense of entitlement. She viewed people as disposable assets. She targeted the elderly because she assumed our minds were failing and our voices didn't matter. She targeted young employees like David because they lacked the resources and leverage to fight back. She had even targeted her own husband, systematically stripping away Lucas's backbone until he was nothing but a hollow, compliant shell, willing to sell out his own father for a shred of her approval. The collateral damage left in her wake was staggering. I left a $20 bill on the table and drove back to the safety of my penthouse. The city was quiet, but a storm was gathering on the horizon. I walked through the building's ornate lobby and nodded to the night concierge. "Mr. Vance," the concierge called out politely, stepping out from behind the polished marble counter. "A courier left this for you about an hour ago. He said it required a signature, but given your strict privacy instructions, I signed for it on your behalf as the building representative." He handed me a thick, rigid legal envelope. It was stamped with the official seal of the county family court. My instincts instantly flared. I took the envelope up to the penthouse, flipped on the bright overhead lights, and tore it open. Inside was a formal copy of an expedited court summons. Lucas and Valerie hadn't even waited for the holidays to end. They had officially filed a petition for my involuntary psychiatric commitment and permanent emergency medical guardianship. Attached to the summons was a heavily fabricated, signed affidavit from that corrupt psychiatrist, claiming I posed an imminent threat to myself and others. They were forcing a competency hearing before a judge in exactly 48 hours. If I failed to show up, or if I lost, they would legally strip me of my human rights, lock me away in a clinical facility, and seize every single thing I owned. The final battle lines had been drawn. The court order attached to the summons demanded a mandatory psychological evaluation prior to the competency hearing. Valerie wasn't leaving this crucial detail to chance. She had handpicked the doctor, Dr. Philip Thorne, whose private practice sat in a high-end commercial district. Dr. Thorne was notorious in elite legal and financial circles as a hired gun. He was a man with a medical degree who specialized in rubber stamping severe dementia, diagnoses for wealthy families, desperate to take immediate control of their aging parents' estates. He provided a medical defense for financial theft, wrapping a brutal robbery in a sterile white lab coat. The next morning, I arrived at the clinic a full 5 minutes early. I wasn't alone. Marcus Reed accompanied me, completely suppressing his usual shark-like corporate aura. Dressed in a simple black suit and holding a chauffeur's cap, he kept his head respectfully bowed, perfectly playing the part of a hired driver for a frail, confused old man. We walked into the sterile, brightly lit waiting room, and the receptionist ushered us into Dr. Thorne's spacious office almost immediately. Dr. Thorne sat behind a massive glass desk, his hands steepled. Wearing a tailored designer suit under a spotless white coat, he radiated a manufactured aura of clinical empathy that made my skin crawl. He looked at me, flashing a sickeningly sweet, patronizing smile, the kind usually reserved for toddlers or the mentally incompetent. "Have a seat, Arthur," Dr. Thorne said, deliberately refusing to use my last name to establish immediate psychological dominance. "Your son and his wife have expressed deep concerns regarding your recent behavior. They tell me you've been highly aggressive, wandering the city aimlessly and suffering from severe paranoia. Let's start with something very simple. Do you know what city we're in right now, and can you tell me what year it is?" I let my shoulders slouch, sinking deeply into the plush leather guest chair. I let my hands tremble slightly, resting heavily on my lap. I gave him the exact performance he was being paid to document. I answered his question slowly, pausing occasionally, as if struggling to grasp a fleeting thought, deliberately looking at Marcus, as if asking for permission to speak. Dr. Thorne grew visibly more confident. Scribbling furiously on a yellow legal pad, he pressed further, shifting his tone to provoke a hostile reaction. "Valerie mentions that you've accused her of stealing your money, Arthur. Paranoia regarding personal finances is a classic, undeniable symptom of cognitive decline. You understand that your family is just trying to protect you from making terrible financial mistakes, don't you?" I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, playing the part of a broken, frightened old man. "I know they want my house," I mumbled softly, letting my voice crack with feigned desperation. "I know they want my retirement." Dr. Thorne smiled, the triumphant grin of a predator. He had his narrative. He leaned forward to deliver the final psychological blow, ready to officially dismiss my lucid complaints as the delusions of a failing brain. But at that precise moment of his absolute arrogance, I tripped the snare. I reached into my heavy coat pocket, acting as if I were searching for a handkerchief. Instead, my trembling fingers hooked the edge of a thick, official-looking legal folder I had deliberately placed there. I pulled it out clumsily, letting it slip from my grasp. The folder hit the polished floor, and its contents scattered violently across the expensive Persian rug. Playing the dutiful driver, Marcus immediately dropped to his knees to gather the loose paperwork, but his movements were just slow enough to ensure Dr. Thorne got a crystal-clear look at the bold red lettering on the face-up documents. Dr. Thorne's smug expression vanished in a millisecond, his eyes locking onto the papers. They were highly authentic-looking, though completely fabricated documents for an irrevocable trust transfer. The paperwork clearly stated that Arthur Vance was finalizing the immediate, unconditional transfer of his entire pension, savings accounts, and the deed to his Back Bay property to a highly aggressive, notoriously litigious national wildlife charity. The documents indicated the transfer was absolute, leaving zero liquid assets or property to any living family members. Marcus quickly gathered the pages, murmuring a feigned apology as he stuffed them back into my coat. But the damage was done. Thorne was a mercenary, and mercenaries only work when the paycheck is guaranteed. He knew Valerie was broke. He knew she was entirely dependent on a rapid cash sale of my home to pay the exorbitant, under-the-table fee he was charging to falsify my medical records. If I donated the house to charity today, Valerie would be bankrupt tomorrow, and Thorne wouldn't see a single dime of his dirty money. A visible layer of cold sweat broke out on Dr. Thorne's forehead. He abruptly stood up from his desk, clearing his throat nervously. "Excuse me, Arthur. I need to consult a colleague regarding a detail in your file. Please wait here." He practically bolted from the room, slamming the heavy wooden door behind him. He hurried down the corridor and into his private, soundproof annex. He thought he was safe, but he had severely underestimated the man he was dealing with. The moment Thorne left the room, Marcus reached up and tapped a small receiver in his ear beneath his driver's cap. Before we arrived, Vince's tech team had hacked into the clinic's internal phone network. Every call routed through Thorne's private office was now being captured and recorded on Marcus's secure server. Marcus nodded to me, a wolfish grin spreading across his face as he listened to the real-time audio feed. Through the patched network, we heard Thorne frantically dialing a number. Valerie answered on the second ring. "Valerie!" Thorne hissed into the receiver, his professional demeanor entirely gone. "We have a massive problem. The old man is sitting in my office right now, and he just dropped a legal file showing he's signing his entire estate over to a charity. The deed, the pension, everything." "What?" Valerie shrieked on the other end, her voice cracking with pure panic. "That's impossible. I have the guardianship petition." "He's executing an irrevocable trust bypass," Thorne yelled back, sweating profusely. "You told me the assets were secure. If he signs those papers before the court hearing tomorrow, you get nothing. And if you get nothing, I don't get my $50,000 consulting fee. I am absolutely not committing perjury and risking my medical license for a bankrupt client. Get this sorted out today, Valerie, or I'm ripping up the affidavit and canceling the hearing." Marcus ended the recording and pulled off his earpiece. We had it. The smoking gun. A licensed medical professional had just admitted on tape to falsifying a medical diagnosis in exchange for a $50,000 payoff from my daughter-in-law. Sitting in that sterile clinic, a deep sense of revulsion washed over me. This was the dark, terrifying underbelly of elder care. People think the greatest threat facing the elderly is a failing body or a declining mind. The truth is far more sinister. The greatest threat is a system that allows greedy relatives to weaponize medical authority for personal gain. Doctors who took a solemn oath to do no harm are actively participating in a sanitized form of human trafficking, stripping the elderly of their legal rights, their dignity, and their homes, all for a cut of the profit. It was an evil, predatory industry that thrived in the shadows, and I intended to completely dismantle this piece of it. Dr. Thorne returned to the office a few minutes later, pale and visibly shaking. He wrapped up the evaluation hastily, offering a few vague platitudes before rushing us out the door. He was a rat fleeing a sinking ship, terrified that his payday was about to evaporate. As Marcus drove us back to the safety of the luxury penthouse, my secure phone buzzed with an update from Vince's surveillance team. Valerie was in total freefall, with Dr. Thorne threatening to back out and the house sale legally stalled because of her sheer panic over the fake charity documents. She was mere days away from her corporate compliance audit. She was completely out of time and out of options. The intercepts showed she was pivoting to a desperate, immediate alternative. Since she couldn't liquidate the house today, she was going to liquidate everything inside it. She had just contacted a high-end, cash-only estate liquidation auction house to illegally sell off all of Eleanor's priceless antique furniture and rare first-edition books over the upcoming weekend. She thought she could turn my most cherished memories into quick cash. She was about to find out that I was the phantom bidder, ready to completely destroy her. I sat in the dim living room of the penthouse, a secure tablet glowing on the glass coffee table in front of me. Vince had easily infiltrated the private estate auction Valerie had organized. She hadn't used a public auction house or a legitimate estate liquidator. She was too desperate and needed to bypass the standard 30-day liquidation period to get cold cash. Instead, she had rented out a sleek modern gallery space downtown and invited her elite, pretentious country club circle to a highly exclusive, invite-only liquidation event. Through the hidden camera clipped to Vince's lapel, I watched my entire life being displayed on cold pedestals under the harsh gallery lights. There was the handmade oak dining table where Lucas ate his childhood meals, the same table where I spent countless nights helping him with his homework. There were Eleanor's cherished rare first edition books and the stunning mid-century mahogany credenza we saved up for 3 years to buy when we were first married. Valerie stood right in the center of the room, wearing a designer cocktail dress and holding a crystal flute of champagne. She was laughing loudly with a group of women draped in expensive furs and diamonds, openly mocking the very items she was selling. "Oh, this old thing," Valerie sneered, running a manicured fingernail over the flawless glass of Eleanor's antique display case. "My father-in-law hoarded this junk for decades. It is dreadfully outdated, but I suppose it has a certain rugged blue-collar appeal. I'm practically giving it away today for pennies on the dollar, just to clear out storage space before he's finally committed to the asylum." My jaw tightened. She was selling my wife's legacy for pennies on the dollar, just to save her own skin, masking her sheer financial panic with a veil of high society arrogance. She had hired a slick, unethical auctioneer who specialized in rapid liquidations for desperate socialites. The auctioneer stepped up to the podium and announced that all transactions today required immediate wire transfers or certified cashier's checks, bypassing all standard tax reporting. Valerie was blatantly organizing a black market asset dump right in front of her wealthy friends. The bidding for the mahogany credenza started. A woman in a fur coat raised her paddle, offering a pathetic $800 for a piece easily worth $8,000. Valerie nodded eagerly, practically radiating the desperate hunger for the cash. I picked up the secure phone and dialed Marcus's proxy bidder. We had hired a high-caliber actor with a flawless European accent to pose as an acquisition manager for a reclusive foreign billionaire. Dressed in a sharp, bespoke suit, he stood at the very back of the gallery, holding a bidding paddle. $10,000, the proxy announced, his voice echoing through the gallery with absolute authority. Valerie's head snapped toward the back of the room. The woman in the fur coat gasped. The auctioneer blinked rapidly, then eagerly accepted the bid. Over the next hour, from the comfort of my penthouse, I orchestrated a complete financial hijacking. Every single time one of Valerie's friends tried to bid on Eleanor's heirlooms, my proxy absolutely crushed them with ridiculous, astronomical numbers. A vintage armchair worth $1,000 went for $20,000. The oak dining table sold for $40,000. I was buying back my own memories, but I was doing it to build a flawless legal trap. Valerie was practically shaking with greed. She watched the sales total skyrocket past $200,000 in minutes, completely abandoning her wealthy friends to cater exclusively to the whale buyer at the back of the room. When the auction concluded, my proxy approached Valerie and the auctioneer in a private back office. Vince followed closely, his hidden camera capturing every single word. "My client is extremely private," the proxy said smoothly, placing a heavy leather briefcase on the table. "He prefers to operate entirely off the books. He will authorize an immediate offshore wire transfer of $250,000 to cover the total. However, he requires you to sign these specific cash receipt forms stating the items were donated, or that the total sale was under $10,000 to avoid luxury export taxes and federal reporting." This was blatant, undeniable tax evasion and international money laundering. A legitimate investment banking manager would have called corporate security instantly. But Valerie was a desperate criminal staring at a financial lifeline. She didn't even hesitate to break the law. She grabbed her designer pen and signed the fraudulent tax documents, effectively committing a federal tax crime on crystal-clear video. Watching her sign her own federal indictment brought a cold wave of satisfaction, but it was mixed with a deep, heavy sadness. Seeing Eleanor's cherished belongings treated like pawn shop collateral broke my heart. I still remembered the day we bought that credenza. Eleanor ran her hand over the smooth wood, turned to me and flashed a smile that lit up the entire room. She said it smelled like the future we were going to build. We built our life piece by piece, protecting our legacy in a world that constantly tried to break us down. Buying these items back wasn't just a calculated legal operation, it was a rescue mission. I was pulling Eleanor's soul out of the dirty, greedy hands of a woman who knew the price of everything but the value of nothing. What sickened me most was that Lucas, my own flesh and blood, was allowing this to happen. He stood by and watched his wife liquidate his mother's legacy to bail them out of their fraudulent debts. The proxy gathered the forged receipts, slid them safely into his briefcase, and shook Valerie's hand. As he turned to leave the back office, he paused, dropping the final, most lethal piece of bait, exactly as Marcus and I had instructed. My client is utterly fascinated by the exceptional quality of these pieces, the proxy said, casually adjusting his suit jacket. He mentioned he might be interested in the estate from which they originated. If the property in Boston's Back Bay is available for a rapid, all-cash transaction, he is willing to pay 20% above market value to close by next Friday. Valerie's eyes widened with pure, unadulterated greed. The final missing piece of her massive embezzlement puzzle had just fallen perfectly into her lap. She had absolutely no idea that she had just agreed to sell my own home back to a mysterious investment group entirely controlled by me. The miniature audio recorder I had taped under Lucas and Valerie's dining room table captured every single sound with chilling clarity. Sitting in the safety of the penthouse, I pressed the headphones deeper into my ears, making sure I didn't miss a single syllable. The heavy front door of their house slammed shut violently. Valerie's high heels clacked rapidly against the hardwood floors, moving with a manic, triumphant energy that cut right through the audio feed. She slapped a thick stack of expedited real estate documents onto the mahogany table, directly above my hidden microphone. "Lucas!" she screamed, her voice trembling with pure, ecstatic excitement. "Get out here right now! We did it! We got the golden ticket!" Lucas's hesitant footsteps approached the dining room. He sounded exhausted, crushed under the suffocating weight of the massive debts that now legally belonged to me. "What is it, Valerie? What happened?" She didn't pause for a single second. "I just found an all-cash buyer for your dad's house. The foreign investment proxy from the estate sale offered 20% above our asking price. $3 million, Lucas. Pure, untraceable cash. Closing this Friday. This covers all your defaulted bridge loans, wipes out the maxed-out credit cards, and completely plugs the internal audit hole at my bank. We are saved." A heavy, telling silence followed. Lucas didn't cheer. He didn't immediately match her frantic excitement. His voice came through the audio feed, weak and wavering. "Valerie, that's Dad's house, the place I grew up. Rushing an off-the-books cash sale to some anonymous foreign entity feels like crossing a line we can never walk back from. If the authorities look too closely at that forged guardianship order, we're looking at federal prison." Valerie slammed her hand onto the table, the sharp crack echoing painfully in my ears. "Don't play the moral victim with me now, Lucas," she hissed, her tone vicious and dominant, stripping away any remaining shred of respect she had for him. "We are standing on the edge of total financial ruin. You blew your pathetic startup and lost all our money. You maxed out the second mortgage just to play your tech entrepreneur role play. If we don't execute this sale today, we are on the streets by Christmas. Act like a man for once in your life. Your dad's brain is completely gone. He's either in some cheap motel or wandering the streets right now, with no idea what day it is. He doesn't need that house, but we absolutely need this cash. Sign the closing authorization right now." I listened as the absolute last shred of my son's conscience evaporated into the cold air. He offered no further resistance, no defense for the man who raised him. The distinct, crisp scratch of a pen sliding across heavy paper filled the audio feed. Lucas was signing away his childhood home, completing his ultimate unforgivable betrayal. Moments later, the loud pop of a champagne cork echoed through the room. They laughed and toasted to their victory, clinking their crystal glasses together, completely convinced they had just executed the flawless crime. I slowly removed the headphones, feeling a cold, dark sense of finality settle deep inside my chest. Marcus Reed sat on the leather sofa across from me in the penthouse, sipping a glass of sparkling water while reviewing a secure legal tablet. He looked up, catching the hardened, ruthless determination in my eyes. "They signed the preliminary closing agreements," I stated flatly, placing the headphones on the glass coffee table. "They're expecting the $3 million wire transfer this Friday morning." A sharp, predatory smile flashed across Marcus's face. He tapped the tablet screen, bringing up the digital contract Valerie had just blindly authorized and transmitted back to his office. She was so blinded by her own greed and desperation that she didn't even bother to perform a basic background check on the buyer, Marcus explained, his voice laced with deep professional amusement. "The foreign investment group she is so thrilled to sell to is a shell company registered in Delaware. It's a wholly owned subsidiary controlled by your phantom trusts. She is literally selling your own house back to you, Arthur." I leaned back against the leather sofa, letting the sheer scale of the trap wash over me. "What happens when she tries to process the wire transfer?" I asked, wanting to hear the exact mechanics of her impending destruction. Marcus set the tablet down and crossed his hands. "That is the absolute masterpiece of this entire operation. Because she insisted on a rapid, off-the-books transaction to evade federal reporting, she knowingly utilized digital networks to transmit fraudulent real estate documents across state lines. By signing those papers and routing the proceeds to an offshore holding account to hide her corporate embezzlement, she has officially committed felony federal wire fraud. The $3 million she is eagerly anticipating will never hit her shadow account." Marcus paused, his smile widening into something truly lethal. "We've already coordinated with the highest levels of banking compliance and the SEC. The exact millisecond she attempts to liquidate that incoming wire, the funds will automatically divert into a heavily monitored federal escrow account. This will trigger an immediate, uninterceptable alert sent straight to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. She thinks she's grasping for salvation. In reality, she just locked her own cell door." I digested the brilliant, devastating strategy. Valerie and Lucas had celebrated far too early. Every single name they signed on those closing documents added 5 to 10 years to their inevitable federal prison sentences. They dug their own graves, bought the tombstones, and happily jumped right in. All I had to do now was throw the final handful of dirt. "We finalize the paperwork tomorrow at the notary," Marcus confirmed, standing up to gather his briefcase and secure documents. "I've arranged for the closing to take place at the most prestigious law firm in the financial district. They are expecting an anonymous corporate proxy to show up with a briefcase full of money to finalize the deed transfer." I stood up and shook my attorney's hand, my grip firm and resolute. "Tell the notary to prepare their largest boardroom," I instructed, "because the proxy isn't going. I will be attending the closing myself." When Marcus left, the penthouse fell into a deep, heavy silence. It was the distinct, unmistakable quiet that happens right before a massive storm. In my 40 years of working with high-pressure commercial piping systems, I learned a fundamental law about catastrophic failure. Before a heavy iron pipe bursts, it doesn't make a sound. The pressure builds internally, expanding the metal on a microscopic level. To the outside world, everything looks perfectly fine, completely intact. Then, in a fraction of a second, the tension surpasses the absolute threshold, and the entire structure violently detonates, destroying everything in its path. I walked into the master bedroom and opened the wide cedar wardrobe. I bypassed the faded wool coats, the cheap flannel shirts, and the worn-out work boots, the clothes I had used to play the part of a helpless, confused victim. Instead, I reached for the heavy garment bag that a private tailor had delivered earlier that day. Inside was a spotless, perfectly fitted charcoal gray suit, a crisp white dress shirt, and a dark silk tie. I meticulously laid the clothes out on the bed, smoothing out wrinkles that weren't even there. I was shedding the outer shell of the broken old man they thought they could easily defeat. I was stepping back into my true power, reclaiming my dignity and my name. Standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, I watched the city lights blink and fade as the pitch-black night gave way to the early morning. The sun slowly crawled over the horizon, casting a cold, bright glare over the towering skyscrapers and busy streets below. Closing day was finally here. The chessboard was perfectly set. The pieces were locked into position, and the final checkmate was only a few hours away. The high-end notary public was located on the 45th floor of a gleaming glass skyscraper, right in the heart of the financial district. It was a space designed purely to intimidate and impress, featuring imported Italian marble floors, panoramic views of the city, and a massive polished mahogany table that dominated the central boardroom. This was the arena where the wealthy finalized their victories. For Valerie and Lucas, this was supposed to be the finish line of their most lucrative and deceitful marathon. They arrived 20 minutes early, radiating an arrogant, intoxicating energy. Through the glass walls of the boardroom, anyone could tell they had dressed specifically for a victory parade. Valerie wore a tailored designer dress that screamed corporate invincibility, paired with diamond earrings, no doubt bought on a maxed-out credit card to celebrate the multi-million-dollar payday she thought was coming. Lucas wore a sharp navy suit, pacing the room with a tense, eager bounce in his step. They asked the polite legal assistant for sparkling water and artisanal espresso, treating her with the same condescension and disdain they reserved for everyone they deemed beneath them. They repeatedly checked their expensive watches, anxiously awaiting the arrival of the foreign proxy who was supposed to hand them their salvation. Right at 10 o'clock, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. Valerie stood up immediately, smoothing down the front of her dress and flashing her brightest, most calculated business smile. Lucas stopped pacing and turned toward the entrance, ready to shake the hand of the man who was about to buy his childhood home with cash. The smile on Valerie's face froze. Then it completely shattered. I stepped into the boardroom. I wasn't shuffling my feet. I wasn't trembling. I wasn't looking at the floor. I wore the spotless, perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, the crisp white shirt, and the dark silk tie. My posture was rigid, my shoulders squared, and my gaze locked onto them with the cold, deadly precision of a sniper. The pathetic, confused old man they had locked in a freezing basement was gone without a trace. In his place stood a financial titan, a man who had built a quiet empire from the dirt, returning to reclaim his throne. Lucas flinched, taking a stumbling step backward until his lower back hit the edge of the mahogany table. "Dad!" he gasped, the air completely knocked out of his lungs. "How are you here? How did you get out of the psychiatric facility?" Valerie recovered from her initial shock, her face flushing red as she erupted in sudden vicious anger. She whipped her venomous glare toward the open doorway, hoping to see a security guard. "Lucas, get him out of here right now," she hissed, pointing a finger at me. "The buyer is going to be here any second. If this crazy old man ruins a $3 million closing with a dementia episode, I swear to God I'll have him permanently committed to a state asylum before noon. Call building security right now." I didn't break eye contact. Slowly and deliberately, I walked to the head of the mahogany table, pulled out the largest leather chair, and sat down. "The buyer's already here, Valerie," I said, my voice echoing through the glass walls with a deep, chilling authority. Valerie let out a sharp, mocking laugh, though her eyes betrayed a sudden flash of sheer uncertainty. "Have you completely lost your mind?" she snapped, grabbing the edge of the table. "You're not the buyer, Arthur. You're just a retired contractor who doesn't even know where his car keys are. Get out of my meeting." I placed my heavy leather briefcase on the polished wooden surface. The sharp metallic click of the brass buckles Snapping open sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence of the room. I reached inside and pulled out the thick, red manila folder Vince had provided. I dropped it right in the center of the table. Next, I took out the small, black digital extraction drive, the one David had used to clone her terminal. I placed it gently right next to the red folder. Finally, I produced a thick stack of notarized and court-certified financial acquisition documents, bound in premium legal backing. I slammed them down right in front of my son with a heavy, echoing thud. "I'm not here to sign a sales agreement," I stated, leaning back in my chair and steepling my fingers. "I'm here to collect." Lucas stared at the documents in front of him, his hands shaking as he read the bold, printed text on the cover page. It was the complete portfolio of his secondary market debt, the bridge loans from his failed startup, his maxed-out credit cards, and his defaulted second mortgage. "Eleanor Holdings," he whispered, reading the name of the shell company that now owned his entire financial life. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization. Eleanor Holdings. Mom's name. "You bought my debt, every single penny of it. I bought every mistake you ever made," I confirmed, my tone flat, entirely devoid of anger, pity, or paternal warmth. "I own the liens on your imported sports cars. I own the note on your house. By midnight tonight, when your accounts officially default, I have the absolute legal right to seize every single asset you own and garnish every wage you earn for the rest of your life. You tried to sell my house to clear your books. You just didn't realize that I am your only creditor." Valerie's face turned completely ghostly. Her eyes darted frantically between the debt documents and the red folder in the middle of the table. She lunged forward, grabbing the red folder and flipping it open. Her breath hitched as her eyes scanned the first page. It was the unedited internal banking ledger showing the $2 million deficit in her accounts, followed by the digital, forensic trail of her offshore transfers, highlighting her systematic embezzlement from high-net-worth elderly clients. "This is fabricated," Valerie whispered, her hands trembling violently, her voice cracking and raspy. "This is an absolute lie. There is no way you could access these files. You're just a stupid, blue-collar old man. You don't have the access, and you don't have the IQ to bypass a banking firewall." I pointed to the black digital drive sitting next to the folder. "That is a direct clone of your terminal, Valerie. It contains the timestamps and biometric override commands you used to force David to authorize your phantom corporate loans. It proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that you tried to use an innocent junior employee as a shield to cover up massive federal wire fraud. You thought you were sprinting toward a multi-million-dollar payday by rushing a black market cash sale of my house to a mysterious foreign investment group. I created that investment group. I laid out a trail of cash, and you blindly walked right into the trap." A deep, agonizing silence fell over the boardroom. It was the sound of absolute, inescapable ruin. The power dynamic had shifted violently and permanently. For months they had treated me like a helpless burden, a biological obstacle standing between them and their unearned wealth. They had mocked my alleged dementia, locked me in a damp basement, and colluded with a corrupt doctor to strip away my human rights. Now the veil was torn off. They realized they had been utterly crushed, outsmarted, and defeated by a man who had silently built a financial empire while they were busy indulging in vanity and debt. Lucas collapsed back into his leather chair, burying his face in his hands as a pathetic, broken sob escaped his throat. In one devastating blow, he had lost everything: his dignity, his father, his home, and his future. But Valerie wasn't surrendering. As the realization hit her that her entire corporate shield had been completely demolished, a primal, animalistic fight-or-flight response kicked in. The polished, arrogant investment manager vanished, replaced by a cornered, desperate predator. Her chest heaved as she threw the red folder back onto the table. "You think you won, you sick old bastard?" she screamed, her voice reaching a hysterical, piercing pitch that rattled the glass windows. You can't prove I generated those files. You obtained this evidence illegally. No court in the country will accept this. I am calling the police right now. I'll tell them you're stalking me, that you're forging corporate documents, and I will make sure the psychiatrist I paid off has you locked in a padded room before sunset." She snatched her designer handbag off the table, her eyes wild with panic and pure rage. Turning on her heel, she stormed furiously toward the heavy double doors of the boardroom, intent on fleeing the building to destroy whatever evidence she left behind at her office. "You're not going anywhere, Valerie," I said calmly, not even bothering to turn my head to watch her run. "Watch me," she spat, grabbing the brass handle of the door. Before she could pull it open, the heavy mahogany double doors burst inward from the outside, forcing her to stumble back in shock. The force of the doors pushing open was so sudden that her designer heels skidded across the polished marble floor as she fought to keep her balance. Standing on the threshold was a tall, impeccably dressed woman with iron gray hair and an expression carved out of solid ice. It was Helen Sterling, the chief compliance auditor of Horizon Wealth Management, and standing directly behind her, no longer trembling, no longer looking like a terrified junior analyst, was David. Valerie froze. The expensive purse slipped from her grip, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. The color completely drained from her face as she looked from Helen to David, and then back to the thick red folder sitting in the center of the conference table. The arrogant, untouchable banker was now facing her own executioners. "Valerie Vance," Helen spoke, her voice cutting through the boardroom with absolute surgical precision. "All of your access privileges to the corporate mainframe were permanently revoked as of 9 o'clock this morning. Building security has already cleared out your desk, and all of your corporate accounts have been frozen." Valerie opened her mouth, stammering as she tried to summon the authoritative, superior tone she always used to bully her subordinates. But all that came out was a desperate, hollow squeak. "Helen, wait! You don't understand. This is a targeted setup. My father-in-law is harassing me. David is lying to cover up his own accounting errors." David stepped out from behind the auditor. He wasn't looking at the floor anymore. He stared Valerie dead in the eye, his shoulders squared with a newfound courage. "I gave them the cloning drive, Valerie," he said firmly. "The board has the timestamps, the biometric override logs, and the audio recording of you threatening to destroy my career if I didn't process your phantom loans. They know everything about the offshore transfers." Helen stepped further into the room, her presence dominating the space. "After receiving an anonymous, encrypted dossier containing undeniable evidence of your systematic embezzlement from our elderly clients, the bank launched a silent emergency audit at midnight. You didn't just violate bank protocol, Valerie. You weaponized our institution to prey on vulnerable people. And today, your attempt to wire $3 million directly to an offshore account from an unverified real estate transaction triggered automatic federal alerts. You are officially terminated for gross misconduct, effective immediately. The elaborate corporate facade Valerie had spent her entire adult life constructing shattered into a million unfixable pieces in a matter of seconds. She was no longer a respected senior wealth manager. She was an unemployed, exposed, utterly ruined criminal. The moment the realization hit her that she had zero leverage, no job, no money, and no escape route, a terrifying transformation took place. The polished, sophisticated corporate executive completely vanished. In her place stood a cornered, rabid animal. Her chest heaved, her eyes darted wildly around the room, and her hands clenched into tight fists. She was trapped, and her panic instantly mutated into pure, vicious malice. Lucas, who had been slumped in his leather chair, slowly stood up. The massive scale of his wife's crimes finally penetrated his thick skull. He stared at Valerie as if looking at a complete stranger. "Valerie," he whispered, his voice a pathetic mix of confusion and heartbreak. "Stealing from elderly clients, phantom corporate loans. What did you do? Look, we can fix this. We can hire lawyers. We can figure this out together. Valerie whipped her head around, locking her eyes onto Lucas with a gaze of such pure, concentrated hatred that it made him physically recoil. Fix this! Valerie shrieked, her voice tearing through the boardroom like shattered glass. There's no fixing this. You pathetic, spineless loser. Don't stand there looking at me with those stupid, naive eyes. We are in this exact position because of you. Lucas held his hands up defensively, his face turning pale. Me? I didn't tell you to steal money from the bank. I didn't tell you to forge documents. You went broke, she roared, closing the distance between them and jamming a manicured finger directly into his chest. You wanted to play the brilliant tech entrepreneur, and you burned through millions on a worthless startup. You maxed out our second mortgage. You financed imported sports cars we couldn't afford just to impress your mediocre friends at the country club. I had to steal to keep a roof over our heads because I married a total failure. Lucas's lower lip trembled. Standing in the middle of that high-end corporate boardroom, he looked like a reprimanded child. But you said you loved me. You said we were a team. A vicious, ugly laugh erupted from Valerie's throat. A team? Lucas, I never loved you. I only tolerated you. I looked at you and saw a weak, easily manipulated idiot who happened to be attached to a father I thought was sitting on a massive liquid fortune. I married you because I figured Arthur would have a heart attack, die, and drop a massive inheritance into our laps. But your father turned out to be just as stubborn and useless as you are, hoarding that old brick house while we were drowning in your pathetic debts. She paced the room like a caged tiger, unleashing years of built-up venom, desperate to destroy the man she blamed for her downfall. You literally let me lock your own father in a damp basement. You stood by and watched the cops drag him away in handcuffs on a fake domestic abuse charge. You didn't hesitate for a second to sign away your childhood home today without shedding a single tear. You have no backbone, Lucas. You have no morals. You are absolutely nothing but a stepping stone that cracked under my feet. I sat silently at the head of the mahogany table, watching my son absorb the absolute, unfiltered truth of his existence. The words hit him with physical force. Lucas collapsed back into his chair, staring blankly at the polished wood. The realization was devastating and absolute. His entire marriage was a transactional lie. His wife harbored a deep, unadulterated disgust for him. But the deepest wound, the one that completely broke him, was the undeniable truth of his own actions. To please a woman who despised him, Lucas had actively participated in destroying the only person in the room who truly loved him. He traded his father's dignity, legacy, and freedom for the illusion of a sociopath's affection. He abandoned the values Eleanor and I spent decades trying to instill in him. He sold his soul, and in return he got absolutely nothing. He was millions of dollars in debt to me, completely unemployed, and bound to a criminal who felt sick even looking at him. The boardroom fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Valerie stood panting, her chest heaving after her vicious outburst. Helen Sterling looked at her with clinical revulsion, while David stood tall, finally free from the shadow of her tyranny. I didn't say a word. I simply adjusted the cuffs of my tailored suit, letting the crushing weight of the moment fill the room. I hadn't touched them with a single finger, yet they had completely destroyed each other right in front of my eyes. Then, cutting through the heavy silence, came a distinct sound floating up from the city streets 45 floors below. It started as a faint wail of sirens, echoing off the glass and steel of the surrounding financial district. Within seconds, the sound multiplied, growing louder, sharper, and incredibly urgent. It wasn't one car. It was a fleet. The piercing, unmistakable shriek of police sirens echoed right outside the heavy glass windows of the boardroom. The sound was deafening, climbing rapidly up the side of the skyscraper, signaling that the final, inescapable consequences had officially arrived at the front doors of the building. The shrieking sirens abruptly cut out, replaced by the rapid echo of police radios in the marble hallway outside the room. Heavy, synchronized footsteps approached at a terrifying speed. Two uniformed officers stationed themselves on either side of the double doors, stepping back as three federal agents in dark trench coats walked into the room. The bold yellow lettering on their jackets read, FBI Financial Crimes Division. The lead agent, a tall, completely no-nonsense man, bypassed everyone else in the room and locked his eyes directly onto my daughter-in-law. "Valerie Vance," he announced, his voice cutting through the thick tension like a razor blade. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest." Valerie backed away, hitting the floor-to-ceiling glass window. Her arrogant bravado completely evaporated, leaving behind raw, unmasked panic. "Arrest?" she stammered, holding her hands up defensively, her designer dress suddenly looking like a cheap costume. "There must be some mistake. I am a senior wealth manager. I demand to contact my corporate attorney." The agent pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "You have the right to remain silent," he stated, reading her Miranda rights with practiced mechanical precision as he closed the distance between them. "You're being charged with systematic embezzlement, federal wire fraud, and the falsification of medical and legal documents. Your personal and corporate assets have been frozen by federal mandate. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Valerie resisted, struggling frantically as the agent grabbed her arm. The polished, untouchable executive disintegrated into a screaming, desperate criminal in a matter of seconds. "Get off me!" she shrieked, fighting against the cold steel as the handcuffs bit sharply into her wrists. "This is a setup. It's the crazy old man. He planted those files. He forged those transactions." Helen Sterling stepped forward, her arms folded tightly across her chest, showing absolutely zero sympathy. "Audit logs don't lie, Valerie. You stole from elderly clients, and you attempted to use our bank's infrastructure to launder $3 million today. You're going to federal prison." Realizing her corporate shield was completely gone and her lies were entirely useless, Valerie turned her absolute fury onto the only target left in the room. She whipped her head around, locking her venomous glare onto Lucas. As the agents forcefully dragged her toward the boardroom doors, she unleashed a torrent of pure, unadulterated hatred. "This is all your fault," she screamed, her voice cracking with rage and desperation. "If you were a real man, I wouldn't have had to steal. You're a pathetic, useless loser, Lucas. You have nothing. You are nothing." Her screams echoed down the polished marble corridor until the heavy elevator doors slammed shut, taking her down to the waiting police cruisers below. The sudden return of quiet to the boardroom was heavy, suffocating, and incredibly cruel in its finality. Helen and David quietly excused themselves to return to the bank headquarters and assist federal authorities with the ongoing investigation. The grand, spacious room was suddenly empty, save for the two men sitting at opposite ends of the long mahogany table, a father and a son, separated by an ocean of unforgivable betrayal. Lucas remained slumped in his wide leather chair. His breathing was shallow and rapid, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon. He stared blankly at the polished wooden surface, completely paralyzed by the sheer scale of the destruction that had just unfolded in front of him. In the span of 20 minutes, his entire universe had been violently dismantled. His wife had been dragged away in handcuffs, screaming her deep disgust for him. His career, his reputation, and his fabricated luxury lifestyle were burning to ash around him. Slowly, Lucas raised his heavy head. His eyes were bloodshot, tears welling in his eyelids, as his gaze drifted to the thick stack of legal documents, the debt portfolio I had dropped on the table. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against the crisp white pages of the acquisition contract. He flipped open the cover page, reading the stark, undeniable terms of his financial ruin. The numbers stared back at him coldly. $3 million, subprime bridge loans, failed startup investments, and a defaulted second mortgage. All of it consolidated, legally assigned, and now entirely owned by Eleanor Holdings. He looked at me, sitting completely motionless at the head of the long table. The spotless, tailored charcoal suit I wore seemed to amplify the absolute power dynamic between us. Lucas swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper when he finally found the courage to speak. "Dad, you own everything. You bought my debt." "I bought every mistake you ever made," I replied, my tone flat, entirely devoid of anger, pity, or parental warmth. "I hold the liens on your imported cars. I hold the note on your house. By midnight tonight, when your accounts officially default, I have the absolute legal authority to seize every single asset you own and legally garnish every paycheck you earn for the rest of your natural life. You tried to sell my house to clear your ledger. Instead, you sold your soul to a woman who despised you, and you handed the leash straight to me." Lucas began to cry. It was a pathetic, gasping sound, the sound of a man who had completely lost his safety net. "But Mom wouldn't want this," he sobbed, clutching at my late wife's name like a drowning man grabbing a lifesaver. "She loved me. She would want us to be a family." "Don't you ever say her name," I commanded, my voice dropping to a deadly chilling register that made him instantly flinch in his chair. "Your mother worked her entire life to give you a foundation of integrity. She taught you the value of loyalty. You threw those lessons in the garbage and locked her grieving husband in a damp, freezing basement. You stood by and watched a corrupt cop put handcuffs on me based on a lie you knew was fabricated. You don't have a mother anymore, and you don't have a father. You have a creditor. That is the only thing I am to you now." I stood up, buttoning my suit jacket with absolute calm, unhurried precision. I didn't raise my hands. I didn't shout. I simply picked up my leather briefcase, leaving the thick stack of debt documents sitting right in front of him. Turning my back on my only child, I walked toward the boardroom doors. Lucas cried out, begging me to stay, pleading for a second chance. But I didn't break my stride. His pleas hit the soundproof glass walls, completely unanswered and utterly futile. Walking out of that towering skyscraper and into the crisp, biting air of the financial district, I felt a profound sense of finality. The bitter taste of absolute ruin now belonged entirely to Lucas. For years he had chased the illusion of elite status, sacrificing his moral compass to please a partner who viewed him as nothing more than a stepping stone. He had prioritized the flashy veneer of wealth over the quiet, unshakable strength of family. Now that veneer had cracked wide open, revealing nothing but a massive hollow void. He was deeply and irrevocably stuck in the mud, with no wife to dictate his life, no mansion to hide in, and absolutely no one to save him from the consequences of his own monumental cowardice. I returned to the safety of my penthouse, watching the movement of the city below with a renewed sense of peace. Eleanor Holdings had served its purpose flawlessly. I had neutralized the threat, protected my legacy, and delivered a masterclass in silent, devastating accountability. Over the next few days, I monitored the aftermath from a comfortable distance, knowing that the structural collapse of Lucas's life was only just beginning. The arrest of a senior wealth manager makes for fantastic headlines, and the corporate world is absolutely ruthless when it comes to collateral damage. Just 1 week after that ambush in the boardroom, the final domino fell. The scandal surrounding Valerie's embezzlement and federal wire fraud dominated the front page of every local financial paper. Lucas walked into the high-end Cambridge co-working space of his proud tech startup, completely oblivious to the fact that his own professional death warrant had already been scheduled. His major venture capital partners didn't even offer him a seat. When Lucas stepped into the panoramic glass corner office he had spent years cutthroating his way into, he found the lead investor standing behind the desk, holding a morning copy of the Financial Gazette. The headline detailing Valerie's dramatic arrest and the massive elder fraud network was circled in thick red ink. The HR director was already standing quietly in the corner, holding a severance agreement in a cardboard box. "Lucas," the investor said, his voice completely stripped of their usual country club, pat-on-the-back camaraderie. We have a fiduciary duty to our limited partners. Trust is the absolute foundation of venture finance. Your wife is currently sitting in a federal holding cell for stealing millions from senior citizens. Furthermore, our legal department has been notified that your personal wages are about to be garnished to the legal maximum by a private holding firm. You are a total PR disaster. You're terminated, effective immediately. We are triggering the clawback provisions in the corporate charter. Lucas tried to argue, tried to distance himself from Valerie, desperately pleading that he knew nothing about what his wife was doing behind closed doors. But the executives just stared at him with cold, corporate indifference. In the business world he so deeply worshipped, loyalty was just a buzzword. He was escorted from the building by 2 armed security guards, clutching a small cardboard box containing his framed Ivy League degree and a few desk trinkets. He walked a gauntlet of staring faces and whispering colleagues, completely stripped of his title and dignity. He called a rideshare back to his upscale suburban enclave, hoping to lock himself inside and figure out a survival strategy. But the swift, unmerciful machine of Eleanor Holdings had already deployed. As his rideshare turned onto his street, Lucas saw a heavy-duty, flatbed tow truck hooking the front axle of his brand-new imported sports car. A second repossession agent was busy securing Valerie's luxury SUV. Lucas sprinted across the manicured lawn, dropping his cardboard box, screaming at the men to stop. The lead repo agent casually held up a heavy clipboard detailing an immediate default execution order authorized by his primary creditor. "Grace period is over, pal," the agent said, bluntly gesturing for the driver to pull away. "Your accounts defaulted at midnight. These vehicles belong to the holding company now." Lucas turned frantically toward his front porch, intending to lock himself inside. He froze dead in his tracks. A locksmith was busy drilling out the brass deadbolt on his front door, flanked by a county sheriff holding a formal eviction notice. The house was the collateral for the defaulted second mortgage I had purchased. Because of the sheer magnitude of his toxic debt and the criminal seizure of Valerie's assets, the foreclosure process had been fast-tracked, locking him out completely. He was legally barred from stepping foot inside to grab a change of clothes, his electronics, or any hidden cash. He stood on the freezing concrete in nothing but a wrinkled suit, watching his entire manufactured existence get towed down the street. Panic, absolute and blinding panic, finally consumed him. When he tried to buy a hot coffee at a corner diner, his credit cards were instantly declined. His phone calls to his wealthy friends, men he had bought expensive drinks for just a week prior, went straight to voicemail. He was a radioactive pariah. By the time night fell, the bitter winter chill began to seep through the thin fabric of his designer jacket. He had no money, no shelter, and no allies. Desperation forces the brain to look for any available anchor. Lucas remembered that frantic Christmas Eve phone call. He remembered me telling him that I had taken a room at a cheap highway motel on the industrial edge of the city just to get some rest. Assuming I was still a confused, vulnerable old man hiding from the chaos, Lucas walked 3 miles through the freezing sleet, his expensive leather dress shoes blistering his heels, until he saw the flickering neon sign of the roadside motel. He stumbled into the cramped, smoke-filled reception area, leaning heavily against the scratched laminate counter. He begged the night clerk for Arthur Vance's room number. The elderly woman working the desk, who was busy filing her nails, didn't even bother to check the computer. She let out a dry, raspy chuckle. "Vance checked out days ago," she said flatly, "paid in cash, left a tip for the maids, and vanished before the sun came up." Lucas gripped the counter, his chest heaving. "Did he leave a forwarding address? A phone number? Anything?" The clerk rolled her eyes and pointed to a small stack of discarded mail. "He didn't leave a number, but a courier delivered a legal package for him the following afternoon. He had a private courier service forward it to his actual residence. The address is printed right there on the shipping manifest." Lucas snatched the paper, his bloodshot eyes scanning the printed text, and the breath caught in his throat. He recognized the address instantly. It wasn't a nursing home. It wasn't an assisted living facility. It was the Obsidian, the most exclusive, heavily fortified, ultra-luxury residential skyscraper in the entire Boston financial district. It was a building where penthouses traded for tens of millions in cash, a fortress reserved exclusively for foreign dignitaries, tech billionaires, and the absolute elite. It took Lucas another grueling hour to hitchhike and trudge his way back downtown. By the time he finally stood before the towering, illuminated glass facade of the Obsidian, he looked like a broken vagrant. He pushed through the heavy revolving doors, cold rainwater dripping onto the flawless, imported marble floor of the grand lobby. Two massive security guards in tailored suits intercepted him instantly, planting their hands firmly against his chest, blocking his advance. "Sir, you need to step outside immediately," the first guard ordered, his tone leaving zero room for negotiation. Lucas thrashed against their grip, tears of pure desperation streaking down his cold, dirt-smudged cheeks. "No, please, you don't understand. I'm looking for Arthur Vance. He's my father. I'm his son. It's a family emergency. I have nowhere else to go. Please, just tell him Lucas is here." The commotion caught the attention of the chief concierge, a man who managed the privacy of billionaires with ruthless efficiency. The concierge stepped out from behind the polished counter, observing the sobbing, shivering man pinned by security. He noted the name Arthur Vance, knowing full well that the occupant of the main penthouse demanded absolute discretion. The concierge picked up his secure internal phone and dialed my private residence. Far above the chaotic city, I was sitting in a velvet armchair, holding a mug of hot black coffee, watching the winter storm beat against the reinforced glass windows of my penthouse. The secure line let out a soft, muted chime. "Mr. Vance?" the concierge said, his voice a perfect mask of professional calm. "I'm terribly sorry to disturb you at this hour. We have a gentleman in the lobby causing a severe disturbance. He identifies himself as Lucas and insists he is your son. He is currently begging security to let him up, claiming he is homeless and needs immediate family assistance. Should I have law enforcement remove him for trespassing?" I set my coffee cup down, letting the profound, poetic irony of the moment soak deep into my bones. The roles had reversed, completely and violently. Just days ago, Lucas had stood comfortably in his warm, spacious suburban estate, watching his wife lock me in a damp, windowless basement. He had looked down on me, viewing his father as a disposable nuisance, an embarrassing relic of a blue-collar past he desperately wanted to erase. Now, the shiny veneer of his fake wealth had been stripped away. He was the vagrant staining the spotless marble of a billionaire fortress, begging for the protection he had so casually denied me. The universe has a perfect sense of justice, provided you have the patience to let it play out. I could have easily told the concierge to throw him out into the freezing storm. I could have had him dragged away by the police for trespassing, completing his utter humiliation. But walking away in silence wouldn't provide the absolute finality this betrayal demanded. He needed to look into my eyes and understand the exact scale of his failure. "Don't call the police," I instructed the concierge, my voice a low, unshakable rumble that carried absolute authority. "Keep him in the lobby. Do not allow him past the security desk. I'm coming down." The descent in the private elevator took a full 45 seconds. The brushed stainless steel doors slid open with a soft, melodic chime, revealing the vast expanse of the grand marble lobby. The space was a monument to untouchable wealth, bathed in the soft glow of crystal chandeliers and guarded by men who assessed human value with clinical precision. Right in the dead center of this spotless arena stood my son. Lucas was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant, suited corporate executive who had sat at the head of the Thanksgiving table just weeks ago. His tailored suit was wrinkled and soaked through with freezing rain and city grime. His expensive leather shoes, the very shoes he wore while silently authorizing my eviction, were scuffed and waterlogged. He looked small, hollow, and thoroughly broken. The exact second he saw me step out of the elevator, a ragged gasp escaped his throat. He broke away from the guards, who maintained a tight perimeter, and stumbled forward. He didn't reach out to shake my hand or offer even a shred of dignified greeting. The massive gravity of his total destruction finally crushed whatever remaining self-respect he had left. Right there on the polished marble floor, Lucas dropped to his knees. The crisp sound of his bones hitting the stone echoed loudly through the empty lobby. He buried his face in his hands, and a massive, wretched sob tore through the quiet air. "Dad," he cried, his voice a pathetic, wavering pitch that stripped away his entire adult facade. "Please, you have to help me. I have nothing left. The bank took the cars. The police locked me out of the house. My accounts are completely frozen. I'm out on the street in the freezing cold. I'm your son. Please, don't do this to me." I stood exactly 5 feet away from him, my hands resting calmly at my sides. I looked down at the man who carried my blood, searching my own heart for even a single lingering shred of fatherly compassion. There was nothing. The well had run completely dry. "Get up, Lucas," I said, my voice echoing with a cold, unyielding authority that made the nearby security guards instinctively straighten their spines. "Have some dignity." He looked up, his face a tear-streaked, red mask of pure desperation. He didn't stand. Instead, he lunged forward, grabbing the hem of my tailored wool trousers, clinging to me like a terrified child. "I didn't know," he sobbed, the words pouring out of him in a frantic, desperate rush as he tried to shift the blame. Valerie controlled all the accounts. She handled the paperwork. She told me the guardianship was just a standard medical precaution. "She manipulated me, Dad. She brainwashed me into thinking you were losing it. I was just trying to save my marriage. I was terrified of her. I never wanted to sell the house. She forced my hand." I looked down at his trembling hands. The very fingers clutching my clothes were the ones that signed the documents to end my life. The sheer cowardice of his excuses sickened me far more than the actual theft ever could. He was a 39-year-old man, a corporate executive who fired people for a living, yet he was kneeling on the floor, blaming a woman for his own total lack of a moral compass. I reached down, grabbed his wrists with a vice-like grip, and forcefully pried his hands off my trousers. I deliberately took a step back, cutting off all physical contact. "Don't throw your pathetic excuses at me and stop insulting my intelligence," I stated, my words hitting him like heavy stones. "You weren't brainwashed, Lucas. You were just greedy. You were perfectly willing to discard your own father like a broken piece of furniture because it secured your luxury lifestyle. You watched your wife lock me in a damp, windowless basement, and then you walked upstairs to sleep in a warm bed. You stood in the home office and didn't say a word while she framed me, and then you looked the police right in the eye to verify a sick lie so I'd be dragged away in handcuffs." Lucas shook his head frantically, fresh tears streaming down his face. "I was weak," he begged, his voice breaking. "I made a horrible mistake. I am so, so sorry. I'll do anything. I'll work for you. I'll pay back every single cent. Just don't leave me in this dead end." "You can't pay back the debt you owe me, Lucas," I replied, my tone entirely devoid of anger, delivering a perfectly surgical execution to his remaining hope. "The debt you owe me isn't financial. It's moral, and you are morally bankrupt. You chose the illusion of wealth over the reality of family. You sold your integrity to a woman who openly despised you." I paused, letting the silence hang between us, making sure my final words would be permanently burned into his memory. "I gave you life, Lucas. I worked my fingers to the bone, working double shifts until my back nearly broke, just to keep a roof over your head and pay for the education you later used to look down on me. But I am under no obligation to finance your greed. I am under no obligation to save a man who handed the axe to his own executioner. You made your choice the night you watched them drive me away from my home. You picked your side. Now you get to live with the consequences." "Dad, please don't do this," he wailed, reaching out for me again. I turned my back on him. I didn't hesitate. I didn't look back. The chief concierge caught my eye and gave a short, subtle nod to the security team. As I walked slowly and deliberately back toward the gleaming stainless steel doors of the private elevator, the heavy hands of the security guards clamped down on Lucas's shoulders. They hauled him up from the floor, ignoring his desperate screams, and began dragging him toward the revolving glass doors that led out into the freezing winter storm. The elevator doors slid shut smoothly, cutting off the sound of his sobbing completely. The entire ride back up to the penthouse was pure silence. I walked over to the wide glass windows, overlooking the sprawling, glittering expanse of the city. The bloodline was officially severed. The son I raised was gone, replaced by a stranger who had finally crossed the absolute limit of my generosity. I mourned the little boy he used to be, but I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of closure. The toxic infection had been successfully cut out of my life. A month later, the bitter winter wind permanently settled over the city, mirroring the bleak reality of Lucas's new life. The foreclosure on his suburban fortress was absolute and final. Eleanor Holdings seized every viable asset, liquidating his imported furniture, his high-end electronics, and his designer wardrobe to pay off a fraction of his massive defaulted debt. In a gritty, run-down neighborhood on the extreme industrial edge of the city, Lucas Vance was quietly erasing himself from the elite society he used to worship. He stood on a cracked sidewalk, wearing a faded, oversized jacket he likely bought from a thrift store. He loaded a cheap, taped-up cardboard box into the back of a rusty, rented moving van. He was moving into a tiny, dilapidated studio apartment located right above a noisy 24-hour laundromat. He had no car. He had no corporate title. His phone had stopped ringing weeks ago. He was completely alone, trapped in a prison of minimum wage labor and heavily garnished paychecks, forced to experience the very blue-collar struggle he spent his entire life mocking. On the other side of the city, in a high-security federal detention center, Valerie was experiencing her own total, systemic collapse. She had tried to use her corporate knowledge to cut a plea deal, offering to testify against higher-up executives. The federal prosecutors laughed in her face. The digital extraction drive provided by David, combined with the staggering evidence of her offshore elder fraud network, left her with zero leverage. She was formally indicted on 34 counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. She was awaiting a federal sentencing hearing that guaranteed she would spend at least 15 years behind bars. The two people who plotted to steal my life had completely obliterated their own, and while they wallowed in the ashes of their greed, I was busy reviving a legacy. I drove my newly purchased, reliable American pickup truck back to the Back Bay neighborhood of Boston, the place that had been my sanctuary for 30 years. I pulled into the driveway of my red brick townhouse. The heavy oak front door, which had been splintered by the movers, had been completely replaced by a beautiful reinforced mahogany frame. The interior of the house was warm, bright, and completely restored. The proxy buyers from the auction had quietly returned every single piece of Eleanor's antique furniture to its rightful place. The mahogany credenza sat proudly in the hallway. The old, rare books were neatly stacked on the shelves. The soul of my home had been successfully rescued. But I wasn't coming back just to spend the rest of my days as a quiet, isolated retiree. I had learned a devastating lesson from the shadows, lurking inside elder care and the financial system. There are thousands of senior citizens who don't have a hidden $12 million phantom trust. Right now, there are vulnerable people trapped in damp basements, stripped of their pensions by greedy relatives and corrupt doctors, completely powerless to fight back. I walked out to the front yard where a crew of professional masons was finishing up my work on the brick retaining wall. They stepped back respectfully, wiping mortar from their hands. Firmly anchored into the brickwork was a heavy, gleaming bronze plaque. The engraved letters caught the bright morning light. The Eleanor Vance Foundation for Elder Legal Defense and Guardianship Reform. Partnering with Marcus Reed, I established a fully funded, highly aggressive, non-profit legal strike team. We weaponized a massive portion of the Phantom Trust to provide free elite-level corporate defense and legal representation to senior citizens facing financial exploitation and medical manipulation by family members. We hired digital forensic investigators, aggressive trial lawyers, and honest medical professionals. We are actively hunting down corrupt psychiatrists like Dr. Thorne and predatory bankers like Valerie. My house is no longer just a home. It is the heavily fortified headquarters of a movement. Standing on the porch, I trace the engraved letters of my late wife's name. Real justice is never just about destroying the people who tried to hurt you. Revenge is just a temporary satisfaction, a fleeting moment of victory that eventually fades into silence. True, lasting justice is taking the very weapons that were used against you and forging them into an unbreakable shield to protect those who cannot protect themselves. I didn't just win the war against my son and daughter-in-law. I won my absolute freedom. I proved that aging does not equal invisibility and that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. At 71 years old, standing on the porch of the house I defended with my own two hands, I am richer in spirit and purpose than I have ever been in my entire life. Sometimes walking away from the people who share your blood is the ultimate victory, leaving you free to protect the ones who truly need your strength. Society has a fatal misunderstanding about getting old. People assume that because our hair turns gray and our pace slows down a bit, our minds must be dulling and our souls are fading into the background. They look at a senior citizen and see a target, a burden, an invisible ghost waiting to be escorted to the nearest exit. They forget that we are the ones who built the foundation they walk on. They forget that an old man's silence is rarely confusion. More often than not, it is precise calculation. I spent decades working, sacrificing, and breaking my back to provide a life for my son, holding on to the naive belief that blood is an unbreakable bond. But blood only makes you relatives. Loyalty, respect, and mutual protection are what truly make you family. When Lucas and Valerie looked at me, they didn't see a grieving widower or a living human being. They saw a decaying vault waiting to be pried open. They mistook my endless patience for absolute weakness. They thought my quiet generosity meant I had surrendered my autonomy. But I learned the hardest lesson a parent can ever face. Unconditional love cannot exist without unconditional respect. Kindness is a gift, but my dignity is not for sale. I will never light myself on fire to keep someone else warm again, especially not for the people who would gladly hand the match to my executioner. Today I am full of life. My physical health is better than it has been in 20 years, because I am no longer carrying the suffocating toxicity of my son's bottomless greed. My blood pressure is perfect. My mind is sharp. I sleep soundly every single night, undisturbed by ungrateful children and their manufactured emergencies. I wake up with a fierce sense of purpose, surrounded by true allies, and driven by the absolute mission of the Eleanor Foundation. I have weaponized my invisible wealth to become an unbreakable shield for those who cannot fight back against their own predators. I am richer than I have ever been, in spirit, in peace of mind, and in absolute freedom. My legacy is no longer tied to a cowardly son. It is bound tightly to justice. I rewrote the ending to my own story, and in doing so, I reclaim my soul. Now I turn to you, the people who have listened to my journey from the very beginning. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have found the strength to fight back from the shadows? Or would the sheer pain of the betrayal have kept you silent? Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member just to save your sanity and protect your life? Deciding to disown your own flesh and blood is never easy, but sometimes it is the only way to survive and preserve your dignity. I want to hear your thoughts, your struggles, and your own stories of reclaiming your power. Let me know in the comments below. Your voice matters, and sharing your truth might just give another person the courage they desperately need to stand up to the abusers in their own lives. Thank you for walking this difficult path with me and for understanding that our worth never diminishes with age. There is one final profound truth I've learned from all of this. The loudest displays of wealth usually mask the deepest levels of desperation. My son and his wife sold their morals just to maintain a fragile illusion of success. They were suffocating under the weight of their own vanity. They believed that expensive suits and luxury cars made them powerful, while viewing my low-key lifestyle as a weakness. But true power never has to shout. Real wealth isn't what you show to the world. It's the quiet security and unshakable integrity you build in the shadows. When you strip away the material greed, your character is all that's left. Please share this story with anyone who needs the reminder. True strength lies in who you are, not in what you own.